Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, both in person and virtually, for Volume 21 Symposium, Beyond the Lab, Animals and Alternatives in Testing and Research. My name is Drew Bhakti, and I have the privilege of serving as the executive editor of the Animal and Natural Resource Law Review here at Michigan State University College of Law. Before we dive into today's panels, I want to take a moment and highlight our journal and explain why gatherings like this are so important to our mission. The Animal and Natural Resource Law Review is one of only 3 law journals in the nation that's dedicated to animal law topics. What sets us apart is our unique focus on the intersection of animal and natural resource law, 2 areas that are deeply connected and increasingly relevant in today's world. Our journal began as the Journal of Animal Law, founded thanks to a generous gift from the Animal Legal Defense Fund and the vision of Professor David Faber, an international leader and pioneer of the field of animal law. Today, we continue to build on that legacy, providing a platform for thoughtful legal scholarship and advancing conversations that impact animals, natural resources, and the legal frameworks that shape them. The Volume 21 Symposium is a reflection of that mission. As you'll see throughout today's panels, we're bringing together distinguished experts in law, science, and policy to explore the transition away from animal testing and the rise of innovative, humane alternatives. From cutting-edge research to regulatory reform, there's so much happening at the crossroads of science and law, and it's crucial that we stay engaged. Whether you're here as a scholar, a student, or an advocate, or someone curious about where this field is heading, I hope you leave today inspired, informed, and energized by the work being done to further non-animal methods in testing and research. Thank you again for being here today, and I have the honor of introducing our editor-in-chief, Abigail Stoll.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Drew. As Drew said, my name is Abigail Stoll, and I'm the 21st volume editor-in-chief of the Animal and Natural Resource Law Review. I would like to begin by reciting the MSU land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who are forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and commit to holding Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indians and Indigenous peoples. I would also like to share with you a preview of the works featured in Volume 21. This year's publication highlights timely, diverse legal issues at the intersection of animal and natural resource law. It covers a vast array of subjects, with a few being a forward-thinking critique of traditional burial practices and their environmental impact, legal pathways toward more sustainable alternatives, a compelling analysis of the legal history and humane management of rat populations in urban environments, and a proposal for a new federal rule of evidence that would allow courts to admit past acts of animal abuse as evidence in cases involving violent acts, supported by legal precedent and behavioral research into animal cruelty. These pieces reflect the journal's continued dedication to publishing high-quality legal scholarship that explores the evolving challenges and opportunities in animal and natural resource law. Thank you, and we hope today's symposium furthers the important conversations that this volume seeks to inspire. Now, please join me in welcoming the Dean of Michigan State University College of Law, Dean Michael Sanambrogio.
Thank you, Abigail. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and to everybody online from all around the world, I hear. Thank you for joining us here at Michigan State University this morning. And thank you for Abigail and Drew for inviting me to your symposium. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge their roles in bringing this together. Abigail, as she mentioned, is the editor-in-chief of the journal, and Drew is the executive editor and the symposium organizer of today's event. Also, of course, our faculty advisor, Professor Dave Faber, over here. Wave for Dave, if you don't know him already. His work has really shaped animal law over the last 25 years or so, and we're really grateful to have him here at the College of Law. As Drew mentioned, the journal is one of only 3 in the country dedicated to animal law. And I think that this is a really fitting place for the Animal Law and Natural Resources Law Review at Michigan State University. We were founded 170 years ago as an agricultural college. And so these are issues that we've been focused on at this university for a very long time. And I think it's really fitting that we have this preeminent kind of journal in this area here at Michigan State University. We were also founded on the goal of democratizing education and sharing knowledge in every part of society, and solving problems in every part of society for the betterment of our community. And this symposium and its focus on animal welfare is also very connected with, furthers that goal. So today we'll hear from internationally recognized scholars, legal experts, and advocates to discuss the future of animal testing and research. And these discussions are not only timely, but essential as we navigate the legal and ethical issues surrounding animal welfare. So we'll hear about the scientific development that seeks to offer alternatives to animal testing in the laboratory. And as technology and research progresses, the law can and must support humane and effective solutions to this societal issue. So to that end, I'd like to welcome some of our distinguished speakers who come from outside of MSU to help us explore today the role that future lawyers can play in this area. So we have Dr. Paul Locke, a renowned scientist and lawyer from Johns Hopkins University, Professor Luciano Wenders over here, who's from the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law School, and also Christy Sullivan. I'm sure is she with us yet? Might be a little bit later joining us. Christy Sullivan is the Vice President of the Institute for In Vitro Sciences. So your scholarship is invaluable to this project, and we really appreciate you coming and speaking with us today. So with that, I'll say I hope you have a wonderful symposium. I'm going to be able to stay for a little bit. Unfortunately, I can't stay for the whole day, but I really look forward to the discussions that we have here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Santambrosio, for your opening remarks. I will begin by just talking a little bit about the logistics for today's event. So we have 2 panels. We have one panel before lunch, which has a law and policy and emerging issues focus, which will include Professor Wenders, Dr. Locke, and Justin Goodman, who will be contributing virtually. And for our online contributors, we will have a Zoom chat available during the Q&A session that will follow our panel. Then we will have a lunch break, and then we will follow with our second panel with 4 speakers. So with that, we will begin at 11 o'clock for our first panel. We can take the next few minutes to get some water, get some refreshments, so we can start right at 11 with Dr. Locke. And the moderator for our first panel, I want to welcome her at 11, Angie Vega, Associate Editor of the Animal Legal and Historical Center. So we will get started at 11 o'clock. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We're ready to start our first panel. So I'm proud to honor and introduce our first moderator for this event, Angie Vega. As I mentioned before, she's the Associate Editor of the Animal Legal and Historical Center.
Good morning. Our first panel will explore the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern animal research, including enforcement challenges and policy reform. I'm happy to introduce our first set of panelists, and we have three distinguished speakers joining us today. Dr. Paul Locke, coming from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Professor Delcy Winders from Vermont Law and Graduate School, and join us virtually, Justin Goodman from the White Waste Project. I'll start with Professor Paul Locke. Dr. Paul Locke is an environmental health scientist and attorney specializing in the intersection of public health, environmental law, and regulatory policy. A professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Law of Public Health, he is also a distinguished visiting professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, where he teaches the law and ethics of animal testing. His research focuses on advancing non-animal testing methods, variation on risk policy, and environmental regulation. Dr. Locke has advised government agencies, served on regulatory committees, and worked extensively on legal and policy frameworks for modernizing toxicology. He holds a DRPH from Johns Hopkins, an MPH from Yale, and a JD from Vanderbilt. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Locke.
So first, a little bit about my background. I started my law career on Wall Street. I worked on complex financial transactions. I actually worked in One World Trade Center, which you see a picture of there. I was not there when the unfortunate terrorist attack took place, but and my firm was very lucky. Everyone in my firm got out. But today I'm at Johns Hopkins. I've been on the faculty at Johns Hopkins now for a couple of decades, and I work on alternatives and looking at the policy issues associated with alternatives, as well as trying to develop the science. So a little more about that. I have a toxicology policy team, and this is a picture of us down in our DC building. It was taken in January in DC. The weather was about the same then as it is here now. Hint, hint. We have really an interdisciplinary group. We have postdocs who are lawyers. We have scientists. We have folks who want to be lawyers, folks who are getting their PhDs. Several of them are here today, and you'll hear them in the second panel. Really what we're trying to do is to work on the law-science interface so that more alternatives to animals can be developed and used, especially in the regulatory environment. Okay, so now let me begin kind of the substantive work that we're going to be talking about. These are the federal statutes, regulations, and policies that cover the field of laboratory animal law. And you should be relieved to know I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but I'm going to provide these slides so that you will have the live link so you can get to all these things. But it's a sort of an unusual world, so I wanted to talk a little bit about it. These are the 6 key documents, and you can see that you start out with 2 laws, the Animal Welfare Act, which many of you probably have heard of and know, and Professor Winders is going to talk a lot about that. She has great expertise in the Animal Welfare Act. I know the piece that covers laboratory animal law pretty well, but the act is much broader than that. There's a Health Research Extension Act, which doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but is very, very important, especially if you get money from a public health services organization like the NIH. There are, of course, a series of regulations that the Animal Welfare Act has, and Those are promulgated in sort of the typical fashion. If anyone here take administrative law? Yes, you're shaking your heads, but you're not smiling. That's all right. That was my favorite subject, so I'm that nerdy. But you know the whole notice and comment process. That's how these regulations were put together. Then the next two documents are quote unquote policies. I've listed the Public Health Service policy as quasi-regulations, and I've listed the US government principles as aspirational guidelines. And that's because this is a really interesting and a little bit unusual thing. The Health Research Extension Act is actually implemented through guidance. So there's no regulations associated with that, at least that apply directly to animals and laboratories, but there's this set of guidance documents that apply. There are other guidance documents, but these are the two major ones. Then there's something called the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. That is a document put together by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. It was last updated in 2011. I was on the committee that updated that. And really what that is it's sort of how you run your laboratory animal program. So these are the key documents you want to be looking at if you're interested in this field. I want to spend a little time kind of jumping in to what this administrative world looks like. And I want to start out by trying to answer what's should be a simple question, but ends up being a more complex one. And that is, who's in the regulated community? So as you probably expect, folks who use animals in research, education, and testing are in the regulated community. But there are differences between the way these two statutes, the Health Research Extension Act and the Animal Welfare Act, actually operate. So in the Health Research Extension Act, you have the regulated community defined by those institutions that get these things called assurances, animal welfare assurances, and those are published by OLAW, which is the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. It's part of NIH. And that puts the organization in a position to regulate itself. So the way NIH and OLAW describe this is it's enforced self-regulation. It's a little unusual. For those of you that take administrative law, you probably never seen anything like this. I never saw anything like this before I started to study it. Maybe there are other examples that you could tell me about, but this is the only one that I know of. Now, in the Animal Welfare Act, while you've got more of a traditional administrative structure, what happens is laboratories they register with the USDA, and the USDA sub-agency that handles laboratory animal law and a whole bunch of other actually areas is called APHIS, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services. So they register, and then when they register, if you are working with a protected species, and that's a term of art, then there are a whole bunch of things that have to happen. So that's the regulated community. Now, I want to go over some major features of these laws that make them, I think, interesting and also maybe a little different. So the first thing is, this is something that I was keyed into when I started to practice environmental law, because after I left Wall Street, I practiced environmental law for a number of years. And the first thing I always learned in that is, what is the definition of what you're looking at say? So for example, when I was practicing environmental law, I once had a client come to me and ask me if a surface impoundment had a bottom. That's not an existential question, by the way. That was a real question. And it turns out it doesn't. But I knew that because I was able to look at the definitions. So key definition for us is, what's an animal? So under the Animal Welfare Act, the animal has this long definition, which I'm not going to spin through. But the key features of it is that it includes both live and dead dogs, cats, monkeys. These are the protected species. However, it excludes certain things. And one of the major exclusions here are basically rodents that are bred for research. Now that's a little bit unusual, wouldn't you say? Especially since somewhere between 85 and 95% of all animals used in research are rodents. But that's the definition of animal under this statute, and I've got the regulatory definition here, but it's really the same as the statutory one. Now, under the Health Research Extension Act, there is no definition of animal in the act. However, in the public health policy, the definition of animal is much broader. It's any live vertebrate animal used or intended for use in research. So that does cover rats, mice, and birds bred for research. Okay, so right now, if you're thinking, wow, this is confusing, you've got it. It's very confusing. However, going back to some commonalities, one place where both of these statutes have some commonalities is in establishing these things called IACUCs, which are institutional animal care and use committees. Those need to be established within the organization itself, and they're slightly different in the statutes, but generally they have 5 members. They can't have as few as 3, but generally they have 5 members. The members have to be a doctor of veterinary medicine. They have to have other characteristics. It's supposed to be 1 member that represents the value of the community. And that is the heart of the self-regulatory process. So these are they are in the institutions. They review the protocols. They also do inspections. Okay, so those are some key definitions I want you to know so you have a better sense as to what this administrative law world looks like. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the Animal Welfare Act. And, oh, wait a minute, let me see, did I miss something here? Does the Animal Welfare Act and the Health Research Extension Act and their regulations and policies apply to all facilities that use animals in research? Well, wouldn't that be nice and easy? That's not the way it is. So what you have to do is you have to kind of put on your, Algebra 1 math hat and recognize that the coverage of facilities is a function of the definition of animal and the statutory basis of the law. So does anyone know what the statutory basis of the Animal Welfare Act is? It's the statutory basis of all our environmental laws. It's that good old-fashioned Commerce Clause, right? So broad reach. The statutory basis of the Health Research Extension Act, though, is getting money from a public health agency. So less of a reach. Remember, the definition of animals under the Animal Welfare Act really is about these covered species. And the definition of animals under the Health Research Extension Act is much broader. So what does that mean? That means you can have facilities in the United States doing research with animals that are covered by both laws, that are covered by one or the other law, and are even covered by no law at all. So that creates a very interesting conundrum as a lawyer trying to figure out where a facility down the road fits. Are we having fun yet? Yes, we are. Okay, so I think, how am I doing time-wise?
9 minutes.
9 minutes, okay, I'm blowing through this. So I think what I wanted to do now is talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the current system. So the current, it's very interesting. I have a foot in both worlds. I work a lot with animal lawyers, and I also work a lot with scientists who do animal research. I don't have a lab that does animal research, but I speak with these people all the time because I really need to know their world, and I go to meetings where they attend and listen to scientific papers. So when I ask folks in the world of animal research whether they think they're highly regulated, their answer is yes. We are highly regulated. In fact, we have to comply with the guide. We have to go before the IACUC. We have all sorts of other things we need to do in terms of NIH reporting. And that makes sense when you understand that in order to do top quality research, your animals have to be well fed, they have to be housed properly, they have to have good veterinary care. Because think about it, if you have an animal under stress, their biological systems are going to be very, very, very different from an animal that's not under stress. So you want to make sure that your animals, if you're going to get information from them, are in an environment where they are as quote unquote natural as possible. And I say that, understanding that the laboratory environment isn't necessarily a natural environment. So from the perspective of folks who are doing research, they feel highly regulated. Now, when I go to an animal law conference and I talk to animal lawyers and I ask them, well, what do you think of this system? Guess what they say? Oh, no, I don't see the regulation at all. So why is that? That is because this system, because it's a system of self-regulation, is almost impenetrable with the typical tools that we as lawyers have to reach into the system. So what are that? FOIA, right? Everybody knows what FOIA is. Reporting, the facilities have to report. They do have to report certain covered species, but if you ask me how many animals are used in laboratories in the United States and you want me to give you an accurate number, I can't do that. I can give you a pretty good guesstimate, but I don't really know because ironically, we don't count the number of animals we use. What else? The way the system is set up, it's very, very difficult to tell if there are violations because only the worst violations get reported out to the federal agencies. If violations can be corrected in-house, they're not reported out. So this is a really interesting phenomena that I found, and it's something that's really important for all of you out there, especially if you're a lawyer, because the way I'd like you to think about scientists, the scientists you're going to meet today, and the scientists also that are out in the field doing this work, is I'd like you to think about them as future clients. And I don't know much about the practice of law because I haven't done it in a while, but one thing I remember is that clients are a good thing to have. Now, as a lawyer, one of the things that we can do as lawyers is help transition those clients to a world where they use fewer animals, help them understand what it really takes to do good animal work if they're going to do animal work. And those are conversations that are important to have. And lawyers have a particular set of skills that allow them, I think, to work well with scientists to do that, to have that conversation. So in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of the system, it really depends on kind of where you are. I think some of the strengths are that it is a system. Okay, we have something. We know something is there. It does generate some data. So, for example, as I mentioned, the Animal Welfare Act requires reporting on covered species. And if you go to the USDA website, you can see what that reporting looks like. It's not the nicest data system I've ever used. It's behind and it's sort of hard to search, but there is information there. There is some agency inspection in the USDA side. The USDA does have to do inspections of labs, although I think based on actually a lot of the work of my colleague here, you could say that this system is maybe thin and under-resourced. Would that be?
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, and you will go further, hopefully, on explaining that. I think another thing about the system is there is vet care embedded in the system, that's very important. So the animals do have veterinary care. And for some animals, there's what's known as quote unquote enrichment. So walking for dogs, maybe some better conditions for non-human primates. So in that sense, it is a system. It does have some good features. However, as I mentioned, from those of us on the outside who are interested in the system, even someone like me who's not an insider, but close to an insider, it's very difficult to find out exactly how the system works at any individual facility. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses, bottom line there is, and this is always by the way, the right answer for any question anyone asks you about law or science, it depends. Okay, but that doesn't mean that we can't work together to make this system better for animals, and also better for those of us who care about really making the system function maximally in an effective way. If you want to know more, you can go to this Brooks Institute site. This law fundamentals that Brooks put together is quite good. Professor Winders has several great lectures on that. I put a lecture on laboratory animal law on that. We also have long form papers. So there's plenty of resources there for you if you want to dig into this area. But I think in terms of attorneys, if you want to better protect animals, improve transparency, increase enforcement, and advance science, we can do all those together. And the nice thing about this field for me is that if you want to push and help get more alternatives used, it's a win-win situation. It's a win, of course, for the animals because you're using fewer animals. And it's a win for science because you're doing more human-centric science, because we are increasingly bumping up against the limits of what animal-based science can tell us. So, 1 minute? Okay.
Thank you, Professor Locke.
Well, 1 minute. Never steal a minute from a professor, really. This is actually my last slide. I wanted to thank everybody again, and I want to encourage you to engage with us. We have a bi-weekly blog that we publish, so if you're interested in being a guest blogger, let me know. And I think this is a fascinating field, and I hope that we can recruit some more of you into it. So now, thank you.
Fascinating. Now, let's introduce our next panelist, Professor Delciana Winders. Professor Delcy Winders is an associate professor of law at Vermont Law and Graduate School and the founding director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute, which trains future animal advocacy leaders while centering animals in the fight for environmental protection. Prior to joining Vermont, she served on the faculty at Lewis and Clark Law School, where she established and directed the Animal Law Litigation Clinic. She previously served as the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at the PETA Foundation, and was the first academic fellow of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. Winders has also taught animal law at the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University, Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law, the University of Toledo College of Law, and Tulane University School of Law. His scholarship focuses on the intersection of administrative law and animal law. Please welcome Professor Winders.
Thank you, Angie, and thank all of you for being here. It's really a pleasure to be here with you in person. I assume you're pulling up the slides.
1 moment.
No, it's fine. I can go ahead and get started. So I'm going to build on Dr. Locke's presentation. A law, as hopefully you know at this point in your education, is only as good as its enforcement. You can have the most perfect, most exquisitely drafted law, but if it isn't enforced, it's not really worth the paper that it's written on. So as you've heard from Dr. Locke, it seems like there's this fairly robust regime governing animal experimentation, and indeed those in the business of animal experimentation are quick to bemoan the level of regulatory oversight. But as he also mentioned, those in animal advocacy sometimes take a different view. So I want to talk about kind of what is the de facto reality when it comes to enforcement. What's the situation on the ground? So I am first going to talk about what I call animal experimentation exceptionalism, which is the way in which the Animal Welfare Act treats research facilities differently from all other types of entities that are regulated under that law. So there are 3 key categories of entities that are covered by the Animal Welfare Act: research facilities, animal exhibitors, and then animal breeders and dealers. So those who supply the wholesale pet trade, who supply animals for experimentation and for exhibition. After that, I'm going to talk about what Animal Welfare Act enforcement against research facilities specifically looks like on the ground. Then I'm going to talk about some recent developments that potentially could spell the end of what little enforcement there is under the Animal Welfare Act with regard to research facilities specifically. And then I'll briefly share some thoughts on what we might do to address the situation. So I want to start with some history. So when Congress started contemplating regulating animal experimentation in the 1960s, the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest public funder of animal experiments in the world, vigorously opposed those efforts. And they urged Congress to continue letting research facilities self-regulate, to not pass any laws, to not have any legal oversight. And eventually, it became clear that Congress was finally going to require some level of regulation of animal experimentation. And so at that point, the NIH changed its tune and effectively started begging Congress to put it in charge of implementing the oversight of the research that it was funding. Congress saw that as a conflict of interest and did not go along with that push. Industry was also asking for that. And so Congress sort of looked around to see who else might we put in charge of this, and saw the US Department of Agriculture, which at that point was already responsible for enforcing the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, also had relationships with state veterinarians. And so said, great, they know animals. We're gonna delegate Animal Welfare Act implementation to the USDA. The US Department of Agriculture's primary mandate is to support farmers and to promote American agriculture. So it's not a traditional regulating entity. So it refers to itself as providing services to customers. And while the Animal Welfare Act was being enacted, the USDA made abundantly clear that it did not want responsibility for this statute. So Secretary of Agriculture at the time, Orville L. Freeman, told Congress that cats and dogs are, quote, not areas as to which this department has expertise. He said also that USDA's expertise is limited to, quote, livestock and poultry. And he said the Animal Welfare Act should, quote, be administered by a federal agency more directly concerned. So very little interest in responsibility for the statute. Nevertheless, Congress did foist responsibility for the Animal Welfare Act on the US Department of Agriculture. And that agency's disinterest persisted. So when Congress amended the Animal Welfare Act a few years later to expand its scope, Associate Administrator of USDA, Dr. Francis Mulhern, told Congress that NIH, not USDA, should be responsible for the act. So maybe because of this, we should have known from the beginning that the Animal Welfare Act wasn't going to be robustly enforced. So in the more than a half century since Congress passed the Animal Welfare Act, the USDA's own Office of Inspector General has repeatedly found that the agency is failing to meaningfully enforce the Animal Welfare Act. They've repeatedly found that penalties are so low, they're treated as a, quote, cost of doing business by the regulated community, and that animals suffer as a result of all of this. So in addition to delegating responsibility to a disinterested agency, Congress also structured the law, and you heard this from Dr. Locke, in a way to continue self-regulation. And part of this was limiting the agency's ability to take action against violators of the law when they were research facilities. So another piece of that is that rather than regulating research itself, the Animal Welfare Act focuses on everything surrounding the research. There's a very famous quote from the legislative history that says the research scientist still holds the key to the laboratory door. There is no limit on what you can do to an animal in the name of experimentation, including subjecting them to pain and distress without any mitigation. So the USDA also decided to treat research facilities different in the enforcement realm. So generally speaking, there are a pretty robust number of enforcement mechanisms under the Animal Welfare Act. You have license suspension, license revocation, criminal penalties, injunctions, confiscation, fines. We can talk separately for hours about USDA's failure to use these mechanisms meaningfully, but they are available in the statute. But the situation for research facilities is very different. So Dr. Locke mentioned that research facilities are registered. They are not licensed. So if you're an animal exhibitor, a breeder, a dealer, you need to get a license from the US Department of Agriculture, and that is conditioned on first demonstrating compliance with all of the Animal Welfare Act standards. And then that has to be renewed every 3 years with the demonstration of compliance. If you're a research facility, on the other hand, you simply register. You send in a paper to, well, probably not a paper anymore. You send in a brief document to the USDA saying, hey, I'm experimenting on animals now. There's no application, there's no approval. And so the USDA doesn't have the authority to take away your ability to do research on animals. So no license suspension, no license revocation. Criminal penalties are not available against research facilities. There is one very narrow exception. I should put an asterisk on that. So there is a criminal penalty if someone, quote, forcibly assaults, resists, opposes, impedes, intimidates, or interferes with a government official who's implementing the Animal Welfare Act. And then confiscation In theory, that is available as to research facilities. But for all other types of regulatory entities, the USDA has the authority under the statute to confiscate animals who are suffering as a result of Animal Welfare Act violations. But for research facilities, the USDA can only confiscate the animal if it is, quote, no longer required by such research facility to carry out the test, research test or experiment for which such animal has been utilized. So it's sort of left to the research facility. You still need that animal? Are you done with that animal? And so that leaves us with civil penalties, civil fines. And in theory, those could be quite robust. They're adjusted each year, or they're supposed to be adjusted each year for inflation. So they currently stand at about $13,700 per violation, per day, per animal. So that could add up to something substantial. In addition to that, the Animal Welfare Act says that the USDA shall, in assessing how much to penalize someone, consider a number of factors, including the size of the business. And research facilities, as you might imagine, tend to be the most well-resourced Animal Welfare Act regulated entities. They're often entities with millions of dollars in annual profits, even sometimes billions of dollars in profits. So when you combine that fact with the fact that civil fines are really the only enforcement mechanism available against research facilities, you would expect to find the highest fines assessed against research facilities over other types of regulated entities. Unfortunately, that is not the reality. That's not what's happening on the ground. So to start with, the USDA's primary so-called enforcement mechanism is warnings. So just to give you one example, when an animal was left at the University of Michigan in a dirty cage without any water and nobody realized the animal was there, for 4 days, the USDA issued a warning to the University of Michigan, basically saying, we think you violated the law, please stop. If you keep doing it, we might take more serious action. And for years, across administrations, warnings have been, and now more than ever, are the primary so-called enforcement mechanism. So then we have to ask, are they an effective enforcement mechanism? And what I have found in my research is after a warning, almost 40% of facilities went on to commit 6 or more violations of the animal welfare standard. More than 25% were cited for 1 or more direct violations, and direct violations are considered the most serious. They're ones that are directly impacting the welfare of an animal, as opposed to something like a paperwork violation. And then more than 40% were cited for 1 or more repeat violations. And what that is when you violate the exact same regulatory standard, if, let's say, not giving water to an animal, and you do that repeatedly. And so what happens when these people continue to violate the law after getting warning? You'd expect the penalties to be escalated. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So when someone recidivates after receiving a warning, most often what happens is absolutely nothing. The second most frequent follow-up action is another warning. I've even seen 3 warnings issued in sequence to facilities. In rare instances, you might have a formal administrative complaint or a settlement agreement. And I want to talk about these settlement agreements because they play a really big role. That's how most of the civil fines are imposed. And so I mentioned this $13,700 roughly per violation per animal per day. And so let's think about, for these really well-resourced research facilities, how much is the USDA assessing in fines? In looking at enforcement specifically against research facilities and looking just at serious or grave violations that involve things like animal deaths, the Office of Inspector General found that the USDA, quote, issued penalties to violators that were reduced by an average of 86% from the Animal Welfare Act's authorized maximum penalty, even though these cases involved animal deaths and other egregious violations. The Office of Inspector General went on to say these discounted penalties, quote, are too lenient and may not serve as an adequate deterrent for violators, especially in cases involving egregious violations. So to give you just one example, Loveless Biomedical is a contract research organization with millions of dollars in annual profits and even more in assets. In 2011, Loveless entered a settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of Agriculture for 6 alleged Animal Welfare Act violations, including inadequate veterinary care, a monkey escape, a fatal choking incident with another monkey. And so at that time, Loveless faced up to $60,000 in civil fines. What they were assessed was $21,750, so just over a third of the potential. A few years later, Loveless entered into a second settlement agreement with the USDA for alleged Animal Welfare Act violations, including inadequate veterinary care, improper handling that resulted in numerous deaths, the death of a mini pig, 4 rabbits, 6 guinea pigs, and a primate who suffered for 3 days before succumbing. Another primate was injured, 2 primates escaped. So for these alleged violations, Loveless faced up to $170,000 in potential penalties. They were assessed 10% of that, $17,000. Then in 2022, the USDA entered a third settlement agreement with Loveless for violations including inadequate veterinary care, resulting in the death of a primate, at this time who had marked dehydration, little to no visceral fat, overall thin body condition, and prominently recessed eyes. So this animal was suffering for some time, as well as improper handling that resulted in the death of a second primate. So for these violations, this was only a few violations, but they faced up to $34,170. And instead they paid $6,200, 18% of the potential civil penalties. So these settlements, instead of getting higher and higher, are actually getting lower and lower and lower. So you can see how it is just a cost of doing business. And in 2022, when this third settlement was entered into, Loveless's revenues totaled more than $71 million. Their assets totaled more than $120 million. So it's pretty bleak when you're thinking about how this stuff is actually enforced. But it potentially gets really, really bad. We don't know yet. But my biggest concern at the moment for animals used for experiments, particularly under the current administration, which is with its very aggressive deregulatory agenda, is complete non-enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act. So Animal Welfare Act enforcement has never been robust. It plummeted during the first Trump administration. But the administration's interpretation and application of a Supreme Court decision from last summer, a decision that has not gotten very much attention, could effectively spell the end of enforcement of the law against research facilities. And I should say not just the administration's interpretation and application, but also that of the courts. So SEC, Securities Exchange Commission versus JARCAC, last summer, the Supreme Court held that an agency cannot fine someone for securities fraud unless they first provide a jury trial. And so we have administrative law judges all across the federal government who assess penalties. And the court said, nope, you need to go to a court and have a jury trial to assess a fine. And the reason the court said that was necessary is because security fraud claims with a right to a jury trial existed at the time of our nation's founding. So this reasoning should not apply to the Animal Welfare Act. There was no claim regarding animal welfare at the time of our founding. That's partly why the Animal Welfare Act was such a monumental thing when it happened. And there's also what's called a public rights exception to this jury trial right. And the Animal Welfare Act should fall squarely within that exception. So Animal Welfare Act protections are not private rights, they're public rights. They're not akin to securities fraud violations. But the truth is we just don't know yet how it's going to be interpreted and how it's going to be applied. And apart from one settlement that the USDA entered into a couple days after the JARCAC decision last summer, there has not been a single settlement since. And so now we have more warnings than ever before. And so this matters for enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act across the board, but it matters for research facilities more than any other type of entity because these civil fines are the only enforcement mechanism available. So I'm cautiously optimistic that Bondi, who has been supportive of animal welfare, will hold the position that this precedent does not apply to the Animal Welfare Act and that the courts will agree to that. But it's an open question and the government seems to being cautious until we have some resolution of that. So what can we do given this situation? I think now is a really good time to be thinking more about state and local opportunities for animal protection. Importantly, the Animal Welfare Act does not have a preemption provision, and in fact, it includes the opposite. It says that it does not prohibit any state or political subdivision of such state from promulgating standards in addition to those standards promulgated by the Secretary. Thank you. And it specifically authorizes the USDA to cooperate with state and local officials in implementing not just the Animal Welfare Act, but their own laws, which might be more protective. Historically, states have not taken advantage of this ability, this authority. They have to some degree in other types of regulated industries, but with research, it's been particularly lacking. And it's virtually unheard of to hear enforcement at the state or local level against a research facility. Some states are starting to take some action. So Virginia, for example, recently took action to at least require some more transparency by research facilities in the state, and there's some more bills pending. But there's really a lot of opportunity in this space. So I know we're going to hear from Justin shortly about other pathways, including defunding animal experimentation, which is really important. But so long as we're continuing to experiment on tens, if not hundreds of millions of animals, we need some oversight of those animals. And this may be the best way to obtain that at this point. So thank you. And I look forward to our conversation after Justin's presentation.
Thank you, Professor Winders, for that insightful conversation. It was very concerning. And our final panelist for this group is Justin Goodman. Justin will be joining us virtually today. He is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Public Policy at the nonprofit government watchdog White Coat Waste Project. For more than 20 years, Justin has led high-profile, successful grassroots and lobbying campaigns to enact laws and expose and stop wasteful and cruel taxpayer-funded experiments on dogs, cats, primates, and other animals. Justin's work is regularly featured in major media outlets and has been awarded by the American Association of Political Consultants, Lush Cosmetics, and others. Without further ado, let's hand it over to Justin.
Hi, everyone. There we go. There's my video. Hello, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I spoke at George Washington Law Program last night, so I couldn't make it out. But it's an honor to be here and a pleasure always to speak with Paul and Delcy, Professor Locke, Professor Winters, on a panel about this important issue. I'm not a lawyer, so please forgive me if anything I say runs afoul of your legal sensibilities. I'm a lobbyist, professional troublemaker, and yeah, I'm going to talk about our approach to ending animal experimentation. And I think, one thing you probably get a sense of from the previous two presentations is, two important things is right now under the law, you can do anything to an animal, no matter how stupid or painful, and you can violate the law with impunity. And that's basically given animal experimenters a free pass to do whatever they want without consequences. And part of what we do is not only create a policy and legislative environment that makes animal experimentation a little more difficult, but hopefully creates cultural shifts where doing animal experimentation is actually something that's stigmatized and not celebrated. and drives people to do other things. These are very smart people who have lots of options in life. They don't have to be torturing animals. Most animal experimentation done in the US is done by choice, voluntarily. It's not required by law. So people can make another decision. We just have to make that other decision more appealing for them. So White Coat Waste Project, we're a taxpayer watchdog group. We're not an animal rights group, and we focus very specifically on ending taxpayer funding for animal testing. As Delcy mentioned, the NIH is the single largest funder of animal experimentation in the world. And actually, it goes beyond NIH. There's about 20 federal agencies that are involved one way or another with either conducting animal experimentation or funding or mandating animal experimentation. And in the United States, the federal government actually outspends the private sector 2-to-1 when it comes to animal experimentation. Probably, I would say the floor, because you're hearing we don't have great data. The floor is probably about $20 billion of federal spending every year on animal experimentation in the United States, just from the federal government. And again, that dwarfs the amount the private sector is funding on animal experimentation as well. Now, obviously, animal testing is cruel. I'll give some examples of that. Also, the waste in our name refers to the wastefulness of it. And Paul alluded to this. Animal experimentation, in addition to being inhumane, is also very, very inefficient. The NIH, while being the single largest funder of animal testing in the world, actually gave an award a few years ago to a professor at Yale who estimates that 87.5% of biomedical research, particularly animal experimentation, is wasteful. And there's lots of figures out there. A good kind of number that encapsulates this is between 90 and 95% of drugs that pass animal tests fail in human trials because they don't work or they end up being dangerous because animal testing is a poor way to predict it. So again, in addition to the cruelty of it, it's very wasteful. Lots of time, decades of time, tens and tens of billions of dollars are being wasted on animal experimentation. That's a dead end, and taxpayers are footing the bill for it, despite growing public opposition and the fact that a majority of Americans now oppose animal experimentation. So what we do as an organization, because I work on federal policy, is we have kind of three buckets. We do find, expose, and defund. Finding involves investigating. So we use the Freedom of Information Act, government spending databases, other publicly available resources, state level open records laws to obtain documents from federal agencies, state agencies, colleges, and universities about their involvement in animal experimentation. So this is just a headline from the Washington Post about a FOIA lawsuit we had to file against the USDA for refusing to release documents about kitten experiments it was conducting at a lab that we ultimately shut down outside of Washington, D.C. But just because because these laws are on the books doesn't mean they're enforced, doesn't mean they're adhered to. And FOIA is a great example of that. We submit hundreds of records requests, FOIA requests every year. Some of them are completely ignored. Some of them are acknowledged and never fulfilled. Sometimes you get documents back that are completely blacked out and redacted. So we work with attorneys in-house and outside of the organization to fight back when the government refuses to turn over documents or turns over documents improperly, fight back against those redactions, get the documents turned over, appeal redactions when we have to. So always, again, I'm not an attorney, but we're always working with attorneys to kind of just even do the find element of what we do to get information in the door. And sometimes when we get these documents, again, they're, papers, but also this is a photo of a cat named Copper, who was at the Cleveland VA being used in spinal cord injury experiments. This is a photo we got through a lawsuit against the Department of Veterans Affairs and its Cleveland laboratory. So getting this information is important because also it lets people see what these labs don't want them to see and build the public and political pressure we need to shut these things down. So that's kind of the find element of what we do. Exposing means going out in the world, taking these documents and sharing them with the press. This is a little snippet at the top of this slide from a document we just got from the Department of Defense and the NIH. There's a contract that the federal government issued to a laboratory in China where they're literally abusing 300 beagles a week in drug tests at taxpayer expense. And another snippet from the same document says that they choose beagles because they are small, docile, and easy to domesticate. So they're easy to abuse. The same reason that beagles make great companions, great pets, is the exact reason why they're chosen to be abused in laboratories. So we get this information through our investigations, through FOIA requests, through lawsuits, and then work with, for instance, the press to get the news out. And this is a headline from the New York Post about our work with Congress to shut down that contract. Another way we expose what's happening in laboratories is run advertisements. And we often try to run advertisements in public forums that should, because of the First and other amendments, allow us to speak whatever message we'd like to in a public forum. It's not always that easy, though. There are often unconstitutional policies that government transit agencies and state and local governments have that prevent private nonprofits, for example, from running advertisements about any issue that might be controversial or there might be differing opinions about. But of course, there could be differing opinions about whether you like a Whopper or a Big Mac better. So virtually any ad is going to have some message where people might have differing opinions. So we work with attorneys, again, to fight back when we get a transit company or some other government aligned entity telling us we can't put our message in an advertisement, whether it's on a bus or a train or billboard. There's actually a wide variety of venues where we try to run ads and are told no by either government agencies or contractors representing government agencies. So we regularly file First Amendment lawsuits about that. And then is the defund side of things. This is when we take the information we gather through our investigations and we bring it to Congress and work with Democrats and Republicans to enact laws to help animals. This is us with 2 members of the squad a couple months ago on Capitol Hill with a dog rescued from a laboratory breeder. And this is us with Rand Paul the same day. We work with everyone across the political spectrum, from the Freedom Caucus to the squad, to bring people together and unite them over this one issue to get the government out of the animal testing business. Lobbying is interesting because there's a lot of strategy involved. It's not just going to Capitol Hill to members of Congress and going there and saying this is a good issue that's important. There's a lot of other considerations. You know, if you just look at the raw numbers, less than 1% of bills that are introduced in Congress actually make it to the president's desk. So you could have a great bill that's for a great issue, it's common sense. Like, Paul was talking about how mice and rats are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. It seems like common sense that you'd want to do that, that it would make sense to cover the overwhelming majority of animals in laboratories, but for political reasons, that hasn't happened, and there's actually no appetite on Capitol Hill to make that happen. So even a well-intentioned bill that's well drafted and narrow or broad or whatever, there's a 99% chance that bill is going to fail. So you have to find different net venues to advance legislation to help animals, whether it's animal welfare reforms, issues of enforcement, or in the case of what we do is simply cutting funding for animal experimentation. And there are some types of legislation that, at least in theory, every single year need to be passed by the House and the Senate and signed into law. And these are government spending bills or other big authorization bills, like for the Department of Defense, where you can insert language into these must-pass bills that can help animals. And these are just a few examples of headlines about the work we do to get language inserted into federal spending bills that say, for example, the NIH can't spend money on certain types of animal experiments or certain species, or you can zero out certain projects line by line. You could say grant numbers XYZ can't spend any money next year, which essentially shuts down those projects. And we've had enormous amount of success ending programs by cutting the funding for them, because most animal experimentation is incredibly wasteful and unnecessary, not required by law. And when you cut off the federal funding for it, no one else is going to foot the bill for it. Private organizations are not going to fund the types of things we see the government paying for. So through funding restrictions directed at the Department of Veterans Affairs, which when we started our investigation was doing the most painful experiments on dogs, for example, inside the entire federal government, They were injecting latex into puppies' arteries, forcing them to run on treadmills, to give them heart attacks and then kill them. But we were able to insert language in the VA spending bill over a matter of a few years, tightening it up and strengthening it every year. And we got to a point last year where the Congress told the VA you have to completely eliminate dog, cat, and primate testing by 2026. And actually, they're ahead of schedule and have already stopped testing on dogs and cats, and the primate testing is scheduled to end later this year. And again, these projects, the legislative efforts we have, we don't ban anything. We're not working on increasing oversight or changing animal welfare rules. We simply work on cutting the funding and zeroing out these programs so they simply can't exist anymore. We did the same thing at the DoD this past year. We discovered experiments on dogs and cats, like that contract in China that I mentioned to you. And worked with members of the House and the Senate to get language in the DoD's authorization bill saying they can't spend money on dog and cat testing. Now, we got it through the House. It didn't make it into the final bill that got to the president's desk. But this bill has to come back every year. So then we try again the year after. So I'm working with Congress now to get that language reinserted into the bill. And again, just another example of how we can restrict funding and cut off different projects in the US and around the world. There's over 1,000 laboratories in the US receiving taxpayer money for animal experimentation. And there's over 300 laboratories in foreign countries that receive or are authorized to receive money for taxpayer funded animal experiments. And foreign laboratories are completely exempt from the rules governing domestic laboratories that receive taxpayer funding. We're actually suing the NIH right now over this illegal loophole that they just unilaterally wrote into their guidelines for grants, saying that foreign labs don't have to abide by animal welfare or any other laws that govern domestic laboratories. And then in a perfect world, we get to get animals out of laboratories. This is Marigold, a cat who was being used in the NIH-funded lab. She was there for 12 years. We shut that lab down last year, and she was able to get out and now lives with our president. This is a monkey named Moby, who is an FDA nicotine addiction laboratory down in Arkansas. We were able to cut the funding for and shut that laboratory down. And actually the government picked up the tab to send those monkeys to a sanctuary in Florida. And, Delcy mentioned, the current administration, given our focus on cutting funding for animal experimentation, and I see that as the most efficient and effective way to end animal experimentation is just cutting the money off. We are very, very optimistic, and these are just some headlines. We've been in the press a lot talking about how cuts to the NIH and other federal agencies will actually be good in terms of cutting animal experimentation. And we're already seeing that play out. We're very excited about leadership of these agencies. RFK Jr. is a big supporter of ours. We're included in his book. He's tweeted a bunch about our campaigns. And the incoming heads of the National Institutes of Health, the single largest funder of animal testing in the world, is a fan of White Coat, and we've worked with him a little bit. And down there is Marty Makary, the head of the nominee to head the FDA, who also has shared a lot of our work and been supportive of ours for years. And here says, and this reads like a PETA bumper sticker: dogs are not ours to abuse in barbaric animal experiments. This is I've been doing this for 20 years. This is the first time I have ever been excited about people being nominated to head public health agencies who have an actual track record of saying the right thing on this stuff way before they were nominated for any role to be in the government. And we've been in touch with them and their teams, and I think we're going to see a lot of good stuff happen. And we've been working with folks on both sides of the aisle to encourage DOGE to make cuts to eliminate animal experimentation. This is a piece we did in the New York Post with a Republican Congresswoman, Nicole Malliotakis, the co-chair of the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus. And here's a piece I had in Newsweek a couple of weeks ago with the co-founder of Ben & Jerry's, Ben Cohen, when we were talking about animal experimentation at the DoD and how DOGE, this is another common sense area where DOGE can make progress. And we're always seeing this stuff happen. Elon Musk is sharing our investigations on social media, commenting. I recently testified in the House Oversight Committee hearing about animal experimentation. Elon Musk tweeted here that this is a clip of me talking there. His comment was that it was terrible. And DOJ is starting to cut projects and highlight projects, investigations that we've done. This is an NIH funded lab that's spinning cats on hydraulic tables to make them nauseous from motion sickness experiments that we exposed. And they're starting to cut grants. We've given them lists of billions of dollars line item grants, and they're starting to cut them. I wake up some mornings and you just see tweets from DOJ saying we've cut this project. And here, yeah, Elon Musk again sharing a lot of our content and wins that we're having against animal experimentation. And then this is our latest thing. This kind of went viral, something I spoke about at the hearing a few weeks ago that actually Paul testified about as well, was these transgender animal experiments that the NIH is funding. Donald Trump talked about this, about the results of our investigation in the State of the Union 2 weeks ago. White House has been talking about it, and actually the NIH has started to cancel those grants. And we have documents from through FOIA showing that we are saving millions and millions of dollars, which is great, but also already we've saved tens of thousands of animals who are going to be used in these projects. Some of these projects were in their first year of a 5-year grant, and they've now been canceled. And one grant we were looking at yesterday planned to use 10,000 animals just on one project. We cut it in the first year, meaning just on that project alone, we probably saved about 8,000 animals. And these aren't, we work on a lot of issues with dogs, cats, and primates. Obviously, people care about those animals more. It's easier to get public support for that stuff. But these grants that the DOJ and Trump administration have been cutting are mouse and rat experiments. We have the president talking about mouse experiments. And again, we can discuss whether, why these people care about it and what the reason it is. But ultimately, animals don't care about why or who is helping them as long as someone is. So we're thrilled that the administration is slashing and burning at agencies like the NIH, cutting grants, cutting funding for institutions that conduct an enormous amount of animal experimentation. So I think despite, what people might feel one way or another about what's happening in government, there's a silver lining for animals in laboratories. And this is just a quote I love from that we got through FOIA through a lawsuit about white code and our approach, bringing people together on issues related to animal welfare and taxpayer dollars, and how it's been very effective. I mean, our enemies in the government are saying this. So very proud of what we do. It's different. It's differentiated from what other groups are doing. Obviously, everything we do here, all of us work on this panel, play a different role in what's going on to strengthen existing laws, create new ones, just shut laboratories down. But you need every tool in the toolbox. There's more animals in laboratories than ever, and they need all the friends they can get. So happy to be here, happy to be talking to you all. Here's our contact information. And my email is justin at whitecoatwaste.org if anyone wanted to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Certainly without work like the work that your organization does, we certainly wouldn't know about what goes on inside these laboratories, as Professor Gelsi just said. Just quoted, the scientists hold the keys to the laboratory, so the work you do is extremely important. Thank you. Now we would like to take some questions from the audience.
There's some questions from the chat. This first one is for Professor Wingers. Has your research compared the total number of animals used in research versus the total number of incidents? And in your statistics regarding the percentages of repeat incidents at the facilities, did you count it if it was the same lab or a different lab?
So okay, can you repeat the questions? I'm sorry.
So has your research compared the total number of animals used in research versus the total number of incidents?
Okay.
And then in your statistics regarding percentages of repeat incidents, did you count them as if it was the same lab or different labs?
Okay, so as to the first question, total number of animals versus number of incidents, that's not something that I've looked at. But I can tell you definitively the documented incidents are a very small fraction of the number of animals being used for experiments. And I don't think that's because those violations aren't happening. I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, we're largely deferring to the self-regulatory system. So the institutional animal care and use committees that Dr. Locke talked about, They're doing the oversight, and they're comprised mostly of people from the research facility. So the USDA's oversight is more limited, so they're not seeing violations. That's exacerbated by a policy that the USDA implemented secretly a few years ago. So the USDA announced that they were considering reducing inspection oversight for facilities that had third-party accreditations. And there is a third-party accreditor for research facilities called ALAC, sort of created in an attempt to avoid legislative oversight. And there's scholarship, including by Justin, documenting that ALAC facilities do not have better animal welfare records than non-ALAC accredited facilities. After tremendous opposition to that proposal, the USDA announced that it was not moving forward with it. It then came to light that it actually secretly did do that, and that research facilities that are accredited by ALAC are now given limited inspections. The inspector gets to pick. Do you want to look at the animals? Do you want to look at the records? Or do you want to look at the facility? Traditionally, an inspection is going to look at all three of those things. Now they're just looking at one, and there's no way to tell from the inspection report what they did or didn't look at. And so the oversight is very limited. The second question, I am not positive I understand it, but when I talked about the repeat violations, those were repeat violations by the same facility. So if Loveless was cited for inadequate veterinary care, that repeat number was that same facility would be cited for violating that same welfare standard veterinary care again. So I hope that answers it.
Awesome. And then has any country banned animal testing completely, or are there steps other jurisdictions have taken that could be useful to implement in the US?
This is for the whole panel,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Oh.
Do you want to take it?
Oh, sure. There have been some countries that have banned animal use completely. Those tend to be countries that don't have any animal use at all in laboratories. I can't give you the names of them, but I can give you a citation of where I learned that. It's in a book called The Worldview of Animal Law. I think that's the name of the book by
Yeah, something like that, as close at least, yeah.
That's where I learned that. So that I would check that book for the most up-to-date information. But to the best of my knowledge, no country that has an active research community has done that.
And I can add to that, Justin probably also has thoughts, but even with a number of countries and a number of US states have banned experiments for particular purposes, particularly cosmetics. And some jurisdictions have also banned experiments on particular species or taxa, so primates in particular. The US has the dubious distinction of using more primates for experimentation than any other nation. And then there are countries that much more rigorously regulate. So they have like protocol reviews where they really do a deep dive and assess the merits of an experiment rather than giving carte blanche to any experimenter to do anything they want with animals. But Justin, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd love to just pick up on the last thing you said, Delcy, about carte blanche. I mean, there is literally no ethical review of animal experimentation in the United States. The review of animal experimentation involves, will you abide by the law, which allows you to do anything to animals? And you check a box and you say yes, and you specify how you will do that. But the law is completely permissive. So you can do anything as long as you fill the right paperwork out, and then a committee made up of mostly other animal experimenters and people associated with your institution who have a vested interest in improving your project, approve your project. And that's why when you look at the data on this, and there's lots of publications about this, up to 99% of the projects that get animal testing projects that get proposed are approved because the bar is so low. And there are small things that they do in other countries that could improve the situation for animals. People here don't, the scientific community here is not open to that and not willing to, they don't want any more scrutiny. They don't want more stringent oversight. But things like having a more balanced oversight committee that actually balances the interests of the public, the institution, and scientists. Right now, you have a minimum composition, required composition, So you have to have a member of the community, a veterinarian, and an animal experimenter, basically. But then there's nothing in the law or regulation that says you can't add 10 animal experimenters and have one member of the community, meaning that their vote is essentially useless and they feel outnumbered, and then they don't say anything. And there's a lot of scholarship about that too. So having more balanced oversight. The law in the United States says you have to consider alternatives to animal testing, but you don't actually have to use them. You just check a box and say, yeah, they exist, but I don't feel like it. That's a problem. And yeah, there's just basic transparency we don't have about how money is being spent in these laboratories, what it's being used for, how many animals are there. So yeah, the US is lagging very, very far behind Canada, the EU, and other places on just this kind of like basic transparency and accountability. There's also no harm benefit analysis that's done. So any stupid, trivial question that you think would be an interesting scientific problem to investigate can justify horrendous torture of animals. And there's actually nothing in the law to prevent that. There's no part of the oversight system that says, no, this is too ridiculous to take an animal's life for. And that bears out. I mean, we constantly see examples of that bearing out in real life and being funded by the federal government.
I feel the need to push back a bit here on a couple of fronts. So first of all, I think what you heard here is a great example of different tools you can bring to this field. But where I just want to do a little pushback is in terms of the value of science in animals. I'm not the best person to do this pushback because I don't work with animals in laboratories, but I do read a lot of the literature. And in certain areas, so for example, cosmetics, we have been successful in eliminating use of animals. Now, that is, I think, for many reasons. One of the reasons is because we've had very effective advocates like Justin who have pushed back, and the community's basically said, we're not going to buy cosmetics if they're tested on animals. The other reason is we have alternatives. But the important thing you need to know is that, and I wish this wasn't the case because I'm somebody who wants us to have alternatives and not animals. Animal research still does provide scientific value. Now, I think one of the great things that Justin has done is he has really dug in, and he doesn't really brag enough about the great research he's done. I say that as an academic, but he really has dug into this, and he's found places where there have been funding of experiments that, even if they had scientific merit, and I would argue they don't, but even if they did, they ethically just shouldn't have been done. And I think it's great that those are being eliminated. But there are other places where we still need animal research. What I will tell you is, if we're going to get out of doing animal research, the only way I think we can do it is to evolve rapidly towards a system where we have alternatives that give us better science. So I just want to encourage you to work with the scientific community to make that happen. Use whatever tools you learn today to do that. But the more of you we can get involved, the faster that's going to happen.
I also received a few questions for both of you. The first one is, what would you say is the largest shortfall of current legislation or regulations intended to protect animals used for testing and research?
I would say enforcement, far and away. I mean, there are so many problems. The coverage of species, the very base level of the standards, but there's no enforcement even of what protections we do have. So I think thinking about things like adding a citizen suit provision to the Animal Welfare Act, so that, like with environmental statutes, private citizens and NGOs can bring injunctive actions. Having an animal protection agency who doesn't have conflicting mandates of promoting the exploitation of animals. I think those are things we can think about regarding improving enforcement. And then, of course, the state and local stuff that I mentioned.
No, I would agree with all that. And in fact, I just want to put a plug into an article about that actually talks about adding a citizen suit. If anyone's interested, I'll give them the citation. I would also say that we need a lot more transparency. And this is a place where, if you're listening to this out there or you're in the room and you do research with animals, I would say, really, you need to start to tell us a lot more about what you're doing. So my impression is that you folks in the laboratory are being very, very careful about making sure the pain and distress that their animals are under is controlled as much as possible. I don't think that message is getting out. That's really the only strong thing, in my opinion, that the Animal Welfare Act has, is it has this provision against pain. It doesn't mean you can't, if you're experimenting, that you can inflict pain. It just means you're supposed to control it. But we don't really know. So transparency, I think, is a major weakness. Resources for enforcement, for other things, major weakness. There are a lot of places these laws could be improved. And I also think that in terms of ethical review, we don't have a real ethical review of these. The IACUC does not do what I would call an ethical review. Some European countries have more ethical review processes. So we should look into those and see if they're relevant and if they're useful. I think they would be.
Thank you. Another question that we have is, which regulations or legislation, if any, that have been enacted in the past decade have had the most impact on preventing harm to animals from testing and research?
There's been essentially no legislation passed in the last decade to help animals in laboratories. Paul and Delcy might disagree with that, but in terms of like something that
maybe, I don't know.
In Europe.
Yeah, abroad.
Yeah, maybe in Europe, yeah. But in the United States, the system, the outlook has been pretty bad for legislative reforms to help animals in laboratories. The last major overhaul to oversight really was in 1985, which is 40 years ago, and lawyers are still fighting to get enforcement of some basic provisions of the 1985 law that are not enforced, particularly with regard to improving the situation for living conditions for primates in laboratories. Again, things that you'd think are low-hanging fruit that are common sense that everyone should agree about. The scientific community, and Paul and I are good friends. I've known him for 20 years, but we also disagree on things. I disagree on, number one, the necessity of animal experimentation, but I'd give the animal experimenters way less credit. I think that these are, there's situations where people are involved in harming animals because they have no choice, right? People who work in slaughterhouses, that's not a job they're choosing. That's a job they have to do because they have limited options. People who are torturing animals in laboratories and designing these experiments and getting the grants, these are some of the smartest people out there. They have options. They're choosing to do this. And they've also made the decision to resist oversight, resist transparency, resist reforms, push back against any legislation to improve the situation for animals because they think it's a slippery slope and selfishly don't want them to be next. So even if they're not experimenting on dogs, they're going to oppose restrictions on dog experiments because they're worried that their rabbit experiments might end up on the chopping block. So, I think that the situation now that's happening in this country with people skeptical of science and the type of chainsaw approach that's being taken at these agencies is entirely self-inflicted because you have these animal experimenters, for example, in terms of FOIA, in dozens of states, colleges and universities have lobbied to exempt animal experimentation from open records laws because they don't want people to know what's going on, because they're afraid if they do know what's going on, they're going to be unhappy about it and they're going to want it to stop. So, yeah, I think the scientific community has done a very bad job. They probably admit this too, especially in the current climate of self-regulating and self-policing and being open to common sense reforms that they're going to need to make. But they've done a good job for the last 40 years of resisting any type of meaningful reform.
I think we both want to add things. And you have a question?
We have known each other a long time, and the great thing that you're getting here is different perspectives. So, and that's really important because you need to sort through these, and you need to figure out where you are on the spectrum. I did want to, though, go back to the question about what's been done. So legislatively, in terms of animal welfare in laboratories, I would agree, not much. But there has been a parallel movement in the government to develop alternatives. Now, in my opinion, it's woefully underfunded and woefully underappreciated, and cue up the afternoon panels. It is really important. We need to make an investment in this. And I would be delighted if the NIH money, if you know, the 45 billion, that's a billion dollar budget of NIH just spent 10% on alternatives and not the 0.01% they're spending now. But that is something to keep in mind. So there are a whole bunch of different programs. We can talk about them later. Just keep those in mind because these parallel developments have eliminated some, not enough in my opinion, not fast enough either, animal use.
Quickly, I wanted to mention one interesting legislative update. It's sort of a sad thing to say it might be the most significant, so I don't know that I would, but there is a need for more transparency, as both my co-panelists have said. However, I do think perhaps the biggest value of the Animal Welfare Act right now is an informational one, because we're not getting enforcement, but we are getting information in the form of inspection reports, annual reports from research facilities that show how many and what types of animals they're using and how many are subjected to unmitigated pain and distress, and enforcement actions. And about 10 days into the first Trump administration, all of that information that had been available for years, thousands and thousands of documents, was taken down. And this was despite the USDA repeatedly having acknowledged that under the e-FOIA, it was required to proactively post that information. And so there were amendments to the Animal Welfare Act made through appropriations that affirmatively required the USDA to continue posting that information, to put it back and to continue posting. And so even as we've seen a lot of other information disappear from government websites over the last couple of months, this information has not, and it does provide value for those of us advocating for animals to try to seek other pathways to get help to them, to have at least some basic sense of what's happening. We need more, but I think that is valuable.
Yeah.
Okay, the first one is going to be for Paul. It wasn't that long ago when I didn't see the scientific world just not moving forward without animals. Now that I have learned about your work and the work of other institutions and organizations and the work that's being developed about non-animal scientific methods, I'm more hopeful. I feel like we are on a new era, that we're moving forward, and this is the beginning of ending the use of animals in science. I wanted to ask you, what are those areas in the scientific world that you see transitioning faster? And what are those that present bigger challenges?
Okay, so thank you for that question. So the first thing is cosmetics is a pretty good example of where we've gotten out of the business of using animals. So the way I look at this is I sort of divide this into 4 different buckets: cosmetics, environmental testing for chemicals, pharma, and discovery research. So cosmetics, we're good. Okay, we're not 100% there, but we're good. For environmental testing of chemicals, there has been some legislation. Actually, I should have mentioned it at the last question, so thanks for asking this one. The TSCA bill that was passed in 2016 doesn't require EPA to use alternatives, but it requires EPA to consider those alternatives, to put together a work plan. EPA calls these alternatives new approach methodologies, have a list of those. So that is progressing. That's nice. So there's some value in that. That's moving a little bit faster. Pharma, I have gone on record as saying that FDA is not doing everything they should to be welcoming to alternative methods. We need to do more there. There was a bill passed called the FDA Modernization Act 2.0. It didn't eliminate the use of animals, but it raised the level of alternatives to the same level as animals. So you didn't have to do animal experiments anymore. The FDA Modernization Act 3.0 is working its way through. Pharma is going to take a little longer. Discovery research, that's the research that folks do in labs to learn about new methodologies, learn about how the body works, learn about how cells process things. That's going to take the longest amount of time. It's the most complex. I can't put a timeline on this, but because you sort of can't put a timeline on the development of science, but I think Environmental testing is going to go next in terms of using more alternatives. Pharma after that, discovery research, that will be the last area.
Thank you. And my next question is for Justin, if I may ask really quickly. And specifically about US facilities. I am a little bit familiar with your work and the things that you have been able to uncover. So I know how the animal welfare, what the Animal Welfare Act requires. So I'm wondering, and I should have looked this up before this conference. I didn't go on the USDA website, but I'm wondering if any of these projects that you mentioned on your presentation reported any of the departures from the Animal Welfare Act or the departures from using analgesics, anesthesia, or sedatives under annual reports?
I'm trying to think of the specific examples that I discussed. I mean, the short answer is no. Compared to the number of animals in laboratories, if you look at the number of animals in laboratories, which estimates are about 100 million in the United States, most of those being mice and rats. If you compare the number of animals in these laboratories that are, we have over 1,000, 1,500 labs in the US using animals maybe, compared to the number of either Animal Welfare Act violations that the government cites or that are self-reported, the number is astronomically small. Both the USDA, so if you think about an inspection, for example, USDA goes into a facility that has 20,000 animals in it, just regulated animals, and spends a day there or 2 days there. There is no way they're able to review records of 20,000 animals or even physically see 20,000 animals and what their living conditions are. So that's why I don't put very much stock in the oversight system, because it is just by design so impoverished. They simply cannot pay attention or have the resources and time to actually know what's going on. And the labs aren't very forthcoming about it. I actually got my entire start working on this issue 20 years ago because I was in grad school. There was a monkey lab at the University of Connecticut. And I started investigating it as a kid who had never done this before, didn't know anything. And I was just reviewing their records and found all kinds of Animal Welfare Act violations that the university didn't write down anywhere, that the USDA didn't cite when they went there. Subsequently, after I filed, a grad student was filing complaints with the USDA. They then cited them. They then fined them. Eventually, the lab got shut down. But that level of scrutiny is really not happening anywhere, save for a few places where kind of activists have gone in and really paid attention to what's going on. So I think the worst things happening to animals in laboratories are completely legal and being funded by our government. And, just because, the violations don't make the situation any worse in some cases for animals. It's just the nature of the experiments is the worst thing they're going to experience.
Well, that.
We have one more.
Yeah, I had one. Professor Winters, you had mentioned about that an animal protection agency would be like a potential way for some of these advancements for animals. I was just wondering, are there organizations advocating for something like that right now? How realistic or near to that are we? And are you aware of any other countries that have implemented something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a tiny bit of scholarship on it. David Pizzuto co-authored an article that talks about this idea. I'm working on some stuff related to it. It's the worst possible moment in history to be advocating for this at the federal level. And so there are discussions happening with advocacy groups, but it's not actively being pursued. I'm working on a project with, we have some animal law LLM fellows, and we're looking at jurisdictions that have created something akin to this, whether on a national, state or provincial or local level. And so there are a number of jurisdictions. So Spain, on a local level, Bogota and Medellin in Colombia, actually, and Vermont, for example, just hired someone to head up a new division of animal welfare. So it is something that is starting to emerge, and I think warrants some attention and assessment to see what is effective and what is not. But we're in pretty early days, I would say.
Okay, that concludes the first panel of the symposium. We'll be concluding at 1:30. For those that are here in person, we have delicious Chinese Mexican food. We will see you in an hour and a half. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise and to our audience for their thoughtful questions.
Hi, everyone, welcome back. We're gonna get started here in a minute with our second and final panel for the day, which is alternatives to animals in research and testing, where are they? This science-focused panel will explore advancements and alternatives to animal testing, such as organ-on-a-chip technology, organoids, and in vitro methods. We'd like to introduce our first panelist, Christy Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan joined the Institute for In Vitro Sciences team in 2023 to lead its education and outreach programs, which are designed to advance the IIBS mission. These programs include organizing workshops and trainings to advance acceptance and use of new approach methodologies, or NAMs, engaging with toxicologists and stakeholders to develop educational materials and resources, and acting as an information resource to industry, government, and the animal protection community. Prior to joining IIBS, Ms. Sullivan served as Vice President for Research and Policy at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, where she led a team charged with developing, promoting, and implementing new approach methodologies for the testing of drugs, chemicals, and other products. She has 20 years experience advancing NAMs through scientific scholarship, validation, policy advocacy, and outreach. Ms. Sullivan has served on a number of OECD committees related to specific animal testing and NAM issues, and has provided advice and training to state and federal agencies, including as a past member of the Pesticide Program Dialogue Committee and ad hoc FIFRA Science Advisory Panel and Board Scientific Counselors Reviews. She is currently a member of the executive boards of the Society for the Advancement of Adverse Outcome Pathways, the Society of Toxicology, In Vitro and Alternative Methods Specialty Section, the American Society for Cellular Computational Toxicology, of which she is a founding member, and the editorial board of Computational Toxicology and Toxicology.
Thank you for that. I am something you won't find a lot of us. Well, I'm a scientist advocate, I like to call myself, because I have science, I have an appreciation and understanding and educational background in science, but then I use that knowledge in order to advocate for change in the way that we apply all of our science, specifically with regards to toxicology in my case. So a lot of that means policy, not necessarily legislatively, although I have done quite a bit of lobbying in the past, but also with regard to changing some of the government regulations and requirements and policies and practices related to toxicology so that animal tests are not part of the way that we test the safety of our products. So just really quickly, the Institute for In Vitro Sciences is a testing laboratory. So we do in our laboratory every day, all year long, we do a lot of in vitro testing of products that you find on the shelves, medical devices, cleaning products, cosmetics and personal care. We even recently worked with Apple to assess the sensitization potential of their wearable devices. So we have all of that experience starting in about 1997. We're the oldest in vitro testing laboratory, sole in vitro testing laboratory in the country. But we're also a nonprofit. And with that nonprofit advocacy designation, we take all that knowledge that we have from validating and running in vitro tests and we share it with the rest of the community. So we train regulators, we help to write guidelines, and try to make sure that in vitro testing is integrated into the toxicology application. So these are some of the assays that we do. I will try not to get too deep into the scientific weeds, and feel free to ask me questions if you don't understand some of the terms that I use. But all of these endpoints that are potential harms that chemicals or drugs or products could cause, we test to make sure that those don't happen when the products get out onto the market. Some of these are what are called validated OECD test guidelines, which means they've gone through a process of traditionally being compared to the results from animal tests. And I'll talk about why that's a problem later. But some of them are not validated OECD test guidelines, but will be one day. Dr. Locke talked about the regulated community. In toxicology, we have a little bit of a different regulated community, which are the companies that produce products that they want to put on the market. And this is an example of what the sort of regulatory map looks like for two of our federal agencies, the Food and Drug Administration and the US EPA. So there are lots of different divisions within these agencies that deal with different types of products. And all of those different divisions have different legislative and regulatory contexts for which they use toxicology data. Some of them, like on the FDA on the top, drugs, biologic devices, tobacco products, veterinary products, the companies that produce those products have to abide by certain regulations and requirements that the agencies have set, and often those are animal testing requirements. Other parts of the EPA, that is also true, like for pesticides and industrial chemicals. So where validation comes in is that if we have a new method, which is what is demonstrated by this little guy on the screen there, that is an in vitro skin method made with human skin. And in a laboratory, if you want to use it to generate data that companies can use to register their products for those different regulatory contexts, we have to do validation studies to show all of those different offices that this method provides the data that they want to receive and use. Most of the people that work in those different divisions, like me, were trained toxicologists to use animals. Historically, for decades, toxicology has used lots of different kinds of in vivo animal test methods in order to get that information. So that's where we are currently. Validation is a process where you would compare the results of what you get from the in vitro test to the results of with the same chemicals to the results that we have gotten in an in vivo animal test. But for a lot of different reasons, those results don't often end up comparing well. And that can be a problem because then the animal test, the old test, is treated as a gold standard that the in vitro test cannot live up to, even though the in vitro test is more human relevant and may be providing the right answer. So it's a big challenge and one that we work on every day. Internationally, of course, most companies are registering products out into the world. So there's an organization called the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that aims to harmonize testing guidelines so that if a company does either an animal test or an in vitro test, any kind of test, that data can be used for any country that is a member of the OECD. So we have done a lot of work to try to make sure that the OECD guidelines for chemical testing include in vitro tests and alternatives that can be used and accepted around the world. There are also other kinds of similar organizations for pharmaceuticals, for medical devices, for cosmetics. But these OECD test guidelines can also be used for those products. So it's just a very complicated landscape, I will tell you. In the past 15 or 20 years, there has been honestly a massive explosion in the scientific community in terms of the types of alternatives that are available to give us information, not only in toxicology, but also biomedical research, even though I'm only talking about toxicology here, to give us information about chemicals and their potential harms. This slide is a bunch of different kinds of in vitro assays. On the top, the very top, those are kidney organoids. They're like little balls of kidney cells from humans that can be tested with chemicals to see whether there are impacts on the kidney from a particular chemical. The bottom is an actual model of a human, right here, right behind my head. It's a human, the barrier between your lung and your body is that alveolar endothelial space. So if you inhale air, that goes into your lungs and goes through from the top to the bottom. That is a model of human lung that we can use to test things that are in the air around us. So there's all kinds of different models that we can use. There are also different kinds of in chemico and ex vivo approaches. One of them that I really, really love is in the top middle here. It's a lung slice. So our organization receives lungs that are not fit for transplant, but are still viable. We receive a whole human lung and we cut it into very, very tiny, tiny slices. And so that is a whole cross-section of a lung that drug companies and other researchers can use to assess the effects of their drugs or chemicals on a particular, on our lung function and health. And then there are in silico approaches. These are generally computer-based approaches. And all the words on the screen, you don't have to know the details of what those mean, but there are different kinds of models that are created in silico in order to help us model or predict or understand what the effects of a chemical or a drug might be. One of my favorites actually is that one over there, which is a computational fluid dynamic model of the human lung. And there's a computer program that you essentially give it all the information about a particular patient you're interested in, and then the information about the potential airborne chemical. Like, let's say you're testing a pesticide, and if you spray it in the air, what's going to happen to it if someone inhales it at a certain concentration? And that will give you a model of where the pesticide will go in the lung, and then you can use that information to target your testing. So the challenge is not, do we have enough methods and models? Do we have enough alternatives? The challenge is putting those together in ways that regulators can use to make decisions. Because we're talking about a really different scientific world that exists now than the world that existed when they were trained in toxicology. That is one of my biggest roles, is trying to make that bridge between what kinds of information we get from these alternatives and the decisions, the information that they need to make decisions according to the statutes under which they operate. So the integrated approaches to testing and assessment is something that has been put forward as a way to do that. And it basically just combines all kinds of different information about chemicals, the chemical that you're testing, the question you're trying to answer, and all the potential tests that might be relevant to that question. An example is that the pesticide company Syngenta, about 5 years ago, EPA asked them to do an inhalation test. And they knew that this material is a pesticide. It was very irritating, and so it would simply harm the animals. They didn't want to do it. So they approached the agency about an alternative approach. What they did is that computational fluid modeling that I mentioned earlier, along with an in vitro 3-dimensional upper respiratory airway It's called You can buy it. We use it in our laboratory. So they modeled how the pesticide would be inhaled by humans, and then they tested it on human in vitro cells, and then developed what's called a human equivalent concentration to be able to, for EPA to do its risk assessment, to try to say, okay, well, the risk to workers, the risk to bystanders might be too high, too low, you know, are we concerned about this, basically. This, as you can tell this is way more advanced than what you would normally do, which is to take a bunch of animals and force them to inhale a chemical and try then to extrapolate that to what would happen to a person, okay? So OECD has published a bunch of these integrated approaches now for a bunch of different endpoints. I'm not gonna go into it. Right now, there are, if we want to focus on pesticide testing, just for the sake of argument, companies have to do tests on the active ingredient of their pesticide and also on the formulation or the product. A good example of a formulation would be you go into Home Depot and you buy a roach killer spray. That's a formulation. Or a cleaning product that kills germs. That's a formulation, okay? So EPA regulates, they get about 500 applications per year of formulations. These tests are required and they use about 50 to 90 animals each. But there are also, for active ingredients, a huge list of testing requirements for every new pesticide that has to be conducted in order to put it on the market. And that, a typical package of data using all of these different tests uses mice, rats, dogs, guinea pigs, rabbits, birds, fish, and about at least 12,000 animals, probably a little more every time. So there's good news though. There has been a lot of efforts to replace many of these tests. And for the acute tests that are conducted most often, we have alternatives for 5 out of the 6 of them now. And this is a graph. We don't know much about how many animals are being tested on in the US, except the EPA has actually been really good in terms of providing metrics for how many animals they, the products that they regulate kill, or how many alternatives in this case are being submitted to them. And so this is from the last 5 or 6 years, companies are submitting non-animal methods for the endpoints that they can. EPA also has a really active waiver program. What that means is that a company can say, we don't think we need to do this test, and here's a scientific argument for why. And the EPA can say, okay, we agree with you, and you don't have to do that test. And so that every single year saves between 400 and 18,000 animals just by the EPA being very flexible. So EPA has made very consistent progress. This is just a long list of some of the alternatives that they have been accepting over the last 10 years or so. Because they're taking a strategic approach. They are looking at the regulatory requirements, assessing the advantages and limitations of existing methods, developing the science, and putting out acceptance policies. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I will say that there's a new era in how methods are being validated. We talked a little bit about validation before, where we are getting away from this idea that we have to compare the results of a new alternative test, which might be more human relevant, to an old animal test, which isn't as human relevant. And this is like a government report that was just published talking about how we can do that. We did a project where we tried to do just that. This is a paper that we just published last year for skin irritation. Currently, there are methods for skin irritation. They have been validated and have had OECD test guidelines for more than a decade, but they are not used for pesticides because of various reasons, mostly because of this validation issue. So what we did is looked at the advantages and limitations of the animal test and the in vitro tests with the question, in terms of predicting the potential harm to humans, because that's ultimately what we're concerned about. And I just want to go back to this to show you that actually EPA is a co-author on this paper, so they are fully behind this approach. These pictures show you right here in C, that is what human skin looks like, and those are what the alternative models look like. So they're really giving us a model that is human relevant. The animal tests, on the other hand, do not. We know that rabbit skin is very different. Rabbits have a lot of hair and they have a lot of hair follicles. And so chemicals can penetrate into the skin of animals much more easily than it can the skin of humans. This graph is, I know it's a lot of data, but I'm gonna quickly walk you through it. So this is a study where there are chemicals that have been tested in the rabbit skin irritation test multiple times. And it looked at the probability of getting the same answer if you tested that chemical multiple times in the rabbit test. EPA down here uses a classification system where it says the potency of whether something is a very strong skin irritant, whether it's something like bleach or acid that would get on your skin and totally obliterate your tissue. That's a category 1, that's very dangerous. Versus a category 4 is something that wouldn't irritate your skin at all. So if they repeat testing in the rabbit, 86% of the time, it's going to be a category 1, is gonna again be a category 1. That's good. But if you had a category 2 result, 44% of the time, it's gonna be a category 2 again. That's not even better than flipping a coin. So the reason why this is so important is because if you are now trying to validate an alternative by comparing it to the animal is a moving target. You don't know whether the in vitro method is right or the animal is right. So we've used information like this to be able to convince the EPA and its scientists that we can't just look at one-to-one comparison of the in vitro method and the animal method. And we're making a lot of progress with that. I'm not going to go into this because I think I'm running out of time, right? Okay. So this is a government document that simply talks about how this strategic approach has been taken. This is applicable to all agencies, although the EPA has taken the most advantage of it. And there have been roadmap documents for a number of different agencies. The FDA does have a roadmap to move away from animal tests, but I would echo one of Paul's statements, which is that they really are not moving very fast at all. It's a big problem. The last thing I want to say is that we need money. Not me personally, but the validation efforts are vastly underfunded. And I'm very worried right now during this administration because there are some reports now that the EPA is going to defund its Office of Research and Development completely. And if I can give you one message today, it is that we would not be anywhere as far as we are today without the scientists at the EPA's Office of Research and Development. They're leading the world in developing really complex, amazing scientific models that can help us replace the very complicated endpoints, like does a chemical cause cancer? Does a chemical harm a developing baby? Does a chemical mess with your brain? all of those things are very difficult to tease out in an in vitro system. But EPA has led the world in developing those kinds of methods. And I'm very worried that they are not, if we lose all of those scientists, progress will stop in toxicology. Anyway, lots of training is needed, and that's something that we talk about. And then I think I already said this, so I would say as people who care about animals and care about the policies that impact whether they are going to be used in testing or not, there's a lot to do, and I'm really glad you're all here to learn about it.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan, for that insightful conversation. I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Jason Laird. Jason Laird is a second-year PhD student with a background in toxicology, pathology, and clinical bioinformatics. His doctoral research leverages omics data to understand the molecular mechanisms of neurodevelopmental disorders. Jason earned his MSc in bioinformatics at Brandeis University and is pursuing his PhD in environmental health at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to coming to Hopkins, Jason worked in several roles within the research ecosystem, including preclinical pathology and cancer genomics research. His latest role was with Tufts University as a bioinformatics scientist, where he consulted on several biological data science projects, ranging from genome assembly of novel organisms to spatial transcriptomic analysis of heart disease patients.
All right, thank you for the wonderful introduction. First off, can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful, okay. Then I will share screen. Cool. Can everyone see my screen?
No, not yet.
Yeah.
All right.
We can see it.
All right, cool. All right, well, that is an awesome talk and a hard one to follow. So I will try my best here. And I'm sorry that I could not be there in person. I had a commitment that I had to stay behind and maintain. So anyways, I'm here to talk to you guys about reducing animal research with public data mining. Come on. There we go. So broad strokes, I'm just going to talk about how we as biologists study biological problems, why even bother performing secondary data analysis, and what is the future of public data mining. So I'll start off. I know that I already had an introduction, but briefly cover my history. So I've had two kind of roles. I've worked a bunch of lab-based roles, and more recently, I've moved into data science, machine learning, AI, and I've fallen back down the totem pole, and now I'm a PhD student. So how do we as biological researchers study problems? So I'm probably going to give some people PTSD here by bringing them back to high school biology and reminding them of the central dogma where DNA gets transcribed to RNA, which gets translated to proteins, which go off and do things in the body. And we, as biological research scientists, interrogate changes in each one of these layers, which we kind of call omics layers, to understand the effects of, their changes on health and disease. So these data can come from a different, variety of sources. In vitro, think Petri dish, in vivo from like a live organism, and in silico, think computer modeling of that biological data. But these data aren't necessarily equal in solving human conditions. As the first panelist kind of alluded to, it's, while animal studies excel at maximizing environmental control, reducing variability between the subjects, examining, whole organism trends, human studies are our target organism, right? We're trying to solve human problems. So we're a little bit more confident in human-based research. And, fortunately, over the past 30 years, there's been this explosion of human biological data that is now publicly available for us researchers to use. And the National Library of Medicine houses a number of different databases that research use to deposit their data from their analyses. So these researchers have done the work, they've collected the data, they have published it in papers, and they've deposited it into a repository, which begs the question, why bother to look at it again? And, there are strengths to this, right? They're generating the biological data. They know the intimate quirks of the study design and the data itself. However, they're usually using it to address a specific question, and oftentimes they have smaller sample sizes, which can introduce a little bit of ambiguity if they don't necessarily agree. So where secondary data analysis comes in is you can kind of look at trends across studies, which reduces false positives that we might chase down with animal studies, and can even deliver novel insights by asking different questions with the same data. Weaknesses, though, the subjects in that publicly available data were not selected for your study purpose. And the principal investigators that are, the ones collecting this data might not be collecting the variables that you, as the secondary data analyst, are interested in. But if we were to go ahead and analyze that publicly available data, there are a couple different ways we can do so. We can take one study source and ask a different question, usually useful if it's a really large study with pretty well-organized data. But oftentimes we resort to meta-analyses where you take each one of these studies independently, look for a trend, and look for commonalities, or something that I prefer, pooled analysis, where you take all of the primary data from these data sets, you combine it into one large super study, and you have way more statistical power to tease out trends. And I can't think of a better example of how this has helped humanity than the Cancer Genome Atlas. So this was a massive cancer genomics project to understand the biology of over 30 different cancer types. And for about a decade now, probably more at this point, this data has been publicly available to most of the world. And it has revolutionized the way we have looked at cancer. I mean, the main findings from TCGA are, we have a really good idea of the molecular basis of cancer now. We have made incredible strides in tumor subtyping, and using those subtypes to inform the development of different therapeutics. This has also led to, democratizing analysis. Different people can look at the same data and hopefully come to the same results, which just means better, more translation to the patients, right? And it's also had a bunch of unintended side effects too. There've been, with all of this well-structured and just massive data, there's been crazy developments in data quality control methods, so sample preparation, contamination control that we weren't necessarily looking at before. And it's also just a large collection of normal data as well, which we can use for other fields. So with that, what is the future of public data mining? And I'd like to bring your attention to something we call FAIR. So FAIR data principles are built on data being findable, accessible, interpretable is a big one, reusable. So the benefits of this is, again, you're decentralizing analysis, you're allowing more people to look at the data, which is just going to lead to more robust research findings that are going to translate well and that don't need to be followed up with, just say animal tests. And when you make that data more standardized, you can feed it into things like artificial intelligence models, which I would be remiss not to talk about in the 2020s. And those models have been making amazing strides at diagnosing conditions better, classifying conditions and subtypes, identifying things that drive disease, and even the data collection, structuring, and monitoring itself has all been aided by AI. But I'm giving a talk to lawyers, so I feel like I should mention some of the legal frameworks surrounding fair data and public data access. So there's been a lot of things encouraging fair data principles and policies, and one of them is the 2023 NIH Data Management and Sharing Policy, which promotes data sharing for federally funded research. However, there are other forces at B that kind of challenge fair data principles and policies. One thing that I want to bring your attention to is the Bayh-Dole Act, which allows universities and businesses the right to patent discoveries from federally funded research. So it doesn't give them a crazy incentive to make that data findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable if they can have a patent on it. And an open question to you all, because I am by no means the legal expert here. How can you all as lawyers foster fair data policies? Because it's not necessarily, you know, an obvious choice for pursuing alternatives to animal research, but by making more human data available, we don't need to go down and chase a bunch of leads with animal testing or even open the door for that in the first place. So in summary, findings based on human data are definitely preferable when we are making decisions about human health. And the past 30 years has seen this explosion of publicly available data. And by reanalyzing that data, we bolster our understanding of human health and disease. And when we increase the adoption of fair data principles, that's just going to lead to more reproducible results and support the development of AI models and biological research, which are only going to propel the field of medicine forward. And you all as lawyers can help facilitate this by fostering fair data principles and policies. So, a few acknowledgements. I would like to thank my advisors, Alexander Martins and Dr. Thomas Hartung, the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, and last but by no means least, my wife, Elizabeth Laird, for her love and support. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jason. Our third panelist is Brianne Kincaid. Brianne Kincaid is a fourth-year PhD candidate with a background in toxicology and risk communication. Her doctoral research integrates computational modeling with in vitro testing and a human brain microphysiological system in order to assess the effect of chemical mixtures on developmental neurotoxicity. Brianne earned her Master's of Science at Johns Hopkins Public Health School and continues her studies there today. Brianne previously worked at a public relations and lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., where she directed research and communication on crop protection products, consumer products, commercially important chemicals, and alcohol.
Here. There we go. Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Brianne Kincaid. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing at Hopkins and part of Dr. Locke's toxicology policy team. So I'll be talking about advancing developmental neurotoxicity testing with new approach methodologies today. Just a brief outline. My presentation is going to cover what developmental neurotoxicity or DNT even is, why we should care about it, what the current animal-based testing strategies are, as well as the emerging in vitro new approach methodologies or NAMs, And then two case studies, one showing how NAM data was recently used in EPA decision-making for pesticide registration, and the other covering my own research assessing mixture toxicity using a NAM model. So first of all, why do we even care? Over the past several decades, the prevalence of neurodevelopmental and psychosocial disorders has surged on a multinational scale, with some estimates revealing a 300 to 700% increase in the number of children and adults that are grappling with these challenges. So this steep escalation continues to outpace the contribution of known genetic, biological, and social risk factors for these disorders, such as family history, prenatal nutrition status, and pharmaceutical use, older parental age, and the expansion of school-based screening programs. So as such, there's now a heightened focus on the contribution of environmental chemicals to neurodevelopmental disease etiology. There are currently 350,000 chemicals and registered mixtures in commerce globally, and only a very small fraction of those have ever been assessed for their developmental neurotoxicity potential. So today, the scientific and regulatory fields agree that there's approximately 145 developmental neurotoxicants, with hundreds of thousands of substances that have literally never been assessed for this endpoint. So one reason why these compounds aren't assessed for DNT is that regulatory authorities don't require it. So under TSCA, new chemicals don't have to undergo DNT testing, and EPA will only request data for existing chemicals if substantial laboratory and human epidemiological evidence indicates that there's a potential hazard. Similarly with FDA, DNT testing is only conditionally required when there's evidence of adult neurotoxicity, which is generally a required test for pharmaceuticals, food ingredients, food contact chemicals, or if a drug is specifically intended for use in pediatrics. So when a DNT test is requested or required, the manufacturers need to perform a guideline animal study, which is an experiment that is conducted according to standardized protocols that are set by regulatory and intergovernmental agencies, such as EPA and OECD. The DNT guideline studies typically require rats that are exposed to 3 different dose levels and a control, with 20 litters at each dose level. While the exposure strategy is going to be more systematic, the assessment strategy for DNT is very much not the case. So the petitioners can select from several assessments of behavior, motor, and sensory function, and learning and memory. And there's no guidance describing specifically which cognitive domains must be covered or which particular tests within a domain needs to be performed. And in fact, a recent analysis of DNT data that was submitted to EPA by manufacturers indicated that the battery of behavioral and learning and memory assessments that are submitted in these data registrations don't actually reflect the affected domains of children who are suffering from neurodevelopmental disorders. So these tests end up being just extremely animal and resource intensive. They consume almost 1,000 rats and cost more than $1 million, which is why the DNT testing doesn't happen unless it's mandated. The lack of guidance on what cognitive and behavioral assessments to perform under each testing scenario and the direction to assess these endpoints using outdated statistical methodologies really put the reliability of these guideline studies in question. And from a biological perspective, the species differences between the timing of brain development and the presence and size of certain brain regions between rats and humans, again, brings the utility of the animal models into question. And that's especially since these guideline animal tests don't actually require mechanistic information about the biological mechanisms of toxicity. And they're generally performed using doses that are far higher than what you're going to see in the general public. And the animals are going to be exposed for a much shorter period of time. So this altogether leads to poor translatability of these guideline animal tests to humans. We're spending all of this time and money on assessments that ultimately aren't giving an accurate indication of hazard. So these challenges have really incentivized the development of novel technology that is closer to the human scenario. And when we talk about new approach methods or NAMs in testing, the in vitro portion of that can encompass a wide range of techniques from a simple single cell type grown in a dish to more complex 3D cellular systems that capture the innate physiology and tissue architecture of the target organ. And we broadly call these more advanced, like spheroid, organoid, assembloid, organ-on-a-chip models, microphysiological systems, or MPS. So what are we actually looking at with these new models? It's well agreed upon that developmental neurotoxicity results from the disruption to cellular processes that are essential to the progression of key events along the brain's developmental timeline. And these processes can all be modeled using cells and using human cells, which really eliminates the interspecies differences. We can then map these cellular processes to the specific outcomes that are measured in the guideline animal studies. So there's a degree of coherence between our traditional animal models and the NAMs that were being adopted. But that also brings me to my first limitation of the in vitro methods, is that you can't model all of this in a single cell system. These approaches are all very simplified. They look only at a very specific biological process. So therefore, getting a robust picture of developmental neurotoxicity really requires a combination of testing strategies that cover the entire space of this key event progression. And we call that a test battery. But even though these new approaches are generally going to require multiple individual tests, they can be performed in the span of a couple days and cost roughly 1/20th the amount that it's going to cost to do a guideline animal study. So there is a significant improvement there. And since we're really talking about a paradigm shift in toxicology with the adoption of NAMs, it's important to have confidence that these tests actually work. So EPA and OECD have been working in partnership to determine which specific tests are ready for use in regulatory decision-making. And in 2023, the OECD published its initial guidance on the performance and interpretation of a set of 17 in vitro D&T tests that can be confidently used to model 10 of these key events in neurodevelopment. The most mature tests in this guidance really use those the cell lines and primary tissue models, so the more like traditional cell culture models, rather than those more advanced 3D models. But OECD does intend to regularly update this guidance as the technology advances. And in terms of what determines test readiness, all of these tests have been subject to validation assessments where the same protocol was followed across separate laboratories to make sure that the results are both internally and externally reproducible. The labs use a standardized set of developmental neurotoxicants and known benign chemicals to gauge the range of biological responses that the test can output. The tests also have a defined range of what chemical properties a compound must have to fall within in order for the system to work. So just for example, whether it's like a gas or a liquid. And there's a near universal acknowledgement in the field that the D&T in vitro battery should be used under two scenarios. The first being chemical screening prioritization to identify from that backlog of hundreds of thousands of chemicals which potential bad actors should be subject to further study. And second, in a weight of evidence decision-making alongside these experimental animal and human epidemiological data approaches if possible. So the D&T IVB isn't currently comprehensive enough to be used for decision-making on its own. There are still identified data gaps, which you can see in those white boxes to the right there. And there are still unknown unknowns. Like for instance, we don't have a clear understanding of what causes disorders like ADHD and anxiety. We might know that a particular symptom is caused by an imbalance of neurotransmission, but we don't know what went wrong along that developmental pathway to actually cause that imbalance. So that being said, no model is going to be perfect, but we do know that the animal models of D&T are imperfect. So for my first case study, I'm just going to discuss how EPA incorporated two tests from this D&T IVB into their weight of evidence assessment for pesticide registration. So in 2019, two registrants approached the EPA Office of Pesticide Programs wanting to register L-glufosinate, ammonium salts, and acids as
different pesticides. And a similar chemical, DL-glufosinate, was already a registered pesticide, and its structure is very similar to the two new pesticide formulations. They were isomers of each other, which is basically means that they have the same parts but in different places. So just like the creepy cat here, with its leg and its tail swapped, they are, structurally similar. A guideline DNT animal study was already submitted for the DL form of glufosinate, which showed brain shape and activity changes in neonatal rats. And guideline in vitro data from the DNT IVB was also available for the DL glufosinate pesticide, and that showed altered network activity. So the question here was whether the DNT IVB studies would be sufficient to inform a risk profile for the new L form of the isomers, or whether the registrants were going to have to drop $2 million on a new animal study. So I know this is small, but basically the registrants performed 2 tests from the DNT IVB, a neurite outgrowth test, which is the data on the left, and a network function test, which is the data on the right. Because those 2 tests covered the key events that are expected to affect brain shape and synchronous activity, which were the observed perturbations from that animal test. And their experiment tested the existing DL form of the pesticide, the 2 new L forms of the pesticide, a known negative and a known positive, at dose ranges that reflected the cellular equivalent range of the toxicity from the animal studies. So these positive and negative controls were used as guideposts to really increase the confidence that the in vitro test is working, that if you see a negative, it actually means that it's negative. And they found that the DL and the L-glufosinate compounds all behaved similarly at the same concentrations. So since the biological activity of the L-glufosinate ammonium and acid compounds were the same as each other and the same as the existing DL isomer at the same dose levels, EPA decided that the registrants did not need to perform additional animal tests on these new compounds, saving more than 1,700 animals and almost $2 million. And EPA decided that they would instead use the DL glufosinate DNT toxicity as a stand-in for these 2 new compounds. So I'm going to shift gears just to talk about my own research using one of the more complex microphysiological systems. We affectionately call our models the brain spheres, and we grow them from induced pluripotent stem cells, which are basically skin samples that we de-differentiate back into stem cells and then re-differentiate into brain cells. And they exhibit spontaneous electrical activity and some elements of cortical structure. And the cortex is that like wrinkly part of your brain that's responsible for the higher order cognitive function. And what is way cooler than anything I'm going to show you on my own research is the research by my colleague Delette. We can teach them how to play video games, which is pretty cool. And they can also be assessed with a modified DNT IVB to test for toxicity, which is what I did. So we're all exposed to inorganic contaminants through our food and water systems due to both their natural presence in the soil and groundwater, as well as due to manufacturing and industrial activities. We experience these exposures as a mixture, but we regulate a safe exposure level based on individual compound toxicity. So one of the questions that guided my research was, does exposure to a mixture of arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and lead elicit an additive effect to when compared to the individual contaminant exposure? So basically, do the toxic effects stack on top of one another to create a more dangerous scenario when you're exposed to the mixture? So I used very low doses, which are all at or below the EPA National Primary Drinking Water Regulation maximum contaminant levels, except for lead, because there is no safe level for lead. So I used blood lead levels of children who are living near Superfund sites, which are areas with like legacy manufacturing exposure. And again, reminder from high school biology, neurons have 3 main parts. There's the cell body, which has the DNA, the axon transmits the signal, and the dendrites receive an incoming signal from another neuron. So neurite outgrowth measures the capacity of immature neurons to send out these projections that will eventually become the axon and the dendrites. And this test has specific relevance for network formation and connection between the different subparts of the brain. So we plate our brain spheres and allow them to send out these projections over the course of several days, and we measure their length and their density. So for this test, at such low dose levels, we didn't see any difference between any of the exposures and the controls, but I also want to highlight the variability that you see in the salmon colored control boxes. So our version of the neurite outgrowth assay uses these 3D brain spheres rather than a flat monolayer of neurons like they use in the DNT IBB. So our test has more inherent variability, which means that you need to perform it several times in order to see small differences. And while it can capture toxicity that occurs with high doses very cleanly, it's not going to be an incredibly sensitive endpoint for these low dose exposures that might only cause very slight changes. So another test that I performed was the synaptogenesis assay. Synaptogenesis is basically the formation of the structures that allow neurons to talk to each other. So I stained my brain spheres with fluorescent tags that mark the presynapse, which is like the part of the neuron that's sending the message, and the postsynapse, which is the part of the next neuron that's receiving the message. And when you merge the images of those two, the part where all the colors overlap means that it's a complete synapse. So my results showed that there's a reduction in the level of organization of these pre and postsynaptic components, which is shown by the reduced intensity density on the left. And the tagged proteins, basically they exist in the synapse, but they're not as well organized. They're a bit more spread out and dysregulated compared to the control. And while we have the same number of presynapses and postsynapses, the exposure is causing problems in those coming together to form a complete synapse so the neurons can actually talk to each other. So we see, synapse organization and formation is altered by the inorganic contaminant exposure. And I think the coolest implication of my work was finding out that across most of the tests that I performed, the mixture was actually less toxic than the sum of its parts. So we found that it was often a single contaminant like cadmium that was driving the toxic response in the mixture in the same way that it drove the toxic response when exposed individually. So the effects of the individual metals does not stack up to create a more like super toxic response. And those are some very informative conclusions. But in the regulatory context, there's actually no mandate for EPA to perform risk assessment on the whole mixture of contaminants in our water. And the same goes for FDA when we're talking about contaminants in our food. So these tests haven't been validated in our brain sphere model because that takes time and money and would ultimately be the single job of a lab technician who is dedicated to just running all of these tests on all of the known DNT toxicants and benign substances in order to really characterize the model in a way that would be needed for regulatory decision making. And what I left out earlier was that it actually took 20 years to publish the DNT IBB. Those assays were in use 20 years before OECD actually said you are allowed to use these, or we are, encouraging the adoption of these within regulatory decision making. So that's not much of an incentive for at least academic labs to pursue regulatory acceptance of their models. So what tends to actually happen is that companies implement these more complex NAMs very early on in their R&D pipelines as part of like a product line de-risking. So that they can basically flag potentially problematic chemicals early on so that they don't continue through the R&D stages. They then don't submit this data to regulatory agencies for the most part because they know that it's not going to be data that's accepted. So in my opinion, I think one of the only ways that we're actually going to get around this challenge is for the regulatory agencies to issue guidance on what they specifically want for a NAM to be validated and accepted into the DNT IBB or any other, guidance, so that the stakeholders can shorten the time and money between development of an assay and implementation, so that we can get these more human relevant models into human risk assessment. That's the end of my talk, and I would love to thank my lab, the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, as well as Dr. Locke's toxicology policy.
Thank you, Brianne. The fourth presentation for this panel will be a virtual lab tour of the Kim Lab at Johns Hopkins Department of Biomedical Engineering, presented by Yi-Guang Chu and Dr. Anika Harriet.
Building upon the very informative presentations by my co-panelists, this virtual lab tour is trying to let you guys know how a typical lab working on non-animal method is looking like, what we are doing every day, and what kind of project we are working on, what kind of models we are using. Hope this can help you understand the difficulties we are facing and the promising result we are getting. And if you guys have any questions, I will be here. Anika cannot be here today, so I will try my best to answer all the questions.
Welcome to Baltimore, Maryland, home to Johns Hopkins University, where we house the #1 biomedical engineering program in the nation. My name is Dr. Anika Harriet, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the lab of Dr. Duk-Ho Kim. I obtained my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where I focused on animal models to study muscle physiology. Today, my work is focused on developing patient-based muscle microphysiological systems that better model human pathophysiology for drug development. I've been working with the toxicology policy team here at Hopkins as a scientific consultant since last year.
Hello, my name is Yi-Guang Chu. I'm a PhD student at Hopkins, where I focus on developing validation frameworks for new approach methods to advance their regulatory acceptance. I have worked in the lab for 2 years and used 2D and 3D cardiac microphysiological systems to screen for drug-induced cardiotoxicity. I have a background in environmental health and engineering. I also have a strong interest in public advocacy and have been part of the Hopkins Tox Policy team since 2020. I'm excited to have the opportunity to guide you through the virtual lab tour today.
The lab of Dr. Duk-Ho Kim is located in East Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins Medical Institute in the Ross Research Building. The Richard Starr Ross Research Building was dedicated on June 7, 1991. Richard Starr Ross, Dean of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine from 1975 to 1990, is known for his efforts toward medical modernization. Our lab continues these efforts in the new millennium. Our lab's research efforts center developing human-based microphysiological systems. In the Kim lab, students work with cells isolated from patient biopsy materials, commercially available human cells, or patient-derived stem cells, which can be fabricated from skin or urine samples. These cells are used to manufacture functional tissues on our MPS, or microphysiological system. Our lab primarily uses the commercially available Curie Bio platform to create engineered muscle tissues, or EMTs, as well as engineered heart tissues, or EHTs. We mix the cells we collect with scaffolding materials in these small wells, kind of like a Jell-O mold, and then we place a 2-post array into the mold so that the tissues can grow across them. On this 2-post array, one post is rigid and the other is flexible with a magnet embedded. When the muscle contracts, the flexible post is deflected and the movement of the magnet can be translated into a force output, which is a clinically relevant translational output. Here, a PhD student in the Kim lab, Zhenping Ren, is preparing human muscle cells to be cast into EMTs. Once he has the requisite number of cells, he can begin the process of casting tissues. After 24 hours, the tissues look something like this. Once we have our functional tissues, we can use the Curie Bio electrodes to measure force on the manta ray system. Here, you can see real-time force outputs for our ongoing experiments. By dyeing our tissues with fluorescent indicators, we can also use the Nautilus, which has a camera and LED excitation to measure calcium transients, a critical component of skeletal and cardiac muscle function. These assays are much easier to perform in a tissue engineering setting than they would be in excised tissues from humans or animal models.
While MPS models hold incredible promise, we should keep in mind that this field is still very new. Much of what we do in the lab involves, let's call it hands-on innovation. We often have to customize many components ourselves. Even though we have good models and results, this is just part of pushing the boundaries of what's possible. For our 96 well-engineered hair tissue platform, we designed this aluminum mold and had it manufactured by vendors. We pull silicon polymer into the mold to create these flexible posts for the hair tissue to grow on. Here is the final product. The plate holding this tissue together also needs custom fabrication. We design and 3D print this mold, use polymer to create structures inside a standard 96 well plate. To hold everything together, we designed this aluminum bracket to fit with our handmade posts. The posts fit into the bracket, and then the whole assembly goes into the casting well. It is like a puzzle, all designed and built by ourselves. Here you can see our handmade posts next to commercially available posts for a 24 well plate system. Moving from a lab-based prototype like ours to a commercially ready product is a long journey, as you can see here.
The process to make these engineered muscle tissues and engineered heart tissues can be long and arduous, taking a few hours for a set of 24. But using this system, we have a high rate of success, though it does take time and practice to achieve consistency between tissues.
Automation is one of our attempts. For our 96 well EHT model, we're using this pipetting robot to automate the tissue casting process. We prepare the cells and reagents in advance. The robot is programmed to precisely mix and dispense the correct amounts into the casting wells. All we need to do manually is the final assembly step, putting the posts and the bracket in place. Then let the tissue sit in the incubator overnight. They will be ready. The pros of automation are significant. The robot can cast and maintain the tissues in a high throughput manner, which make large-scale experiments possible, like testing 10 doses of drug together, which would be incredibly time-consuming to do by hand. And notably, automation minimize differences between batches and labs, improving the reliability of our results. Of course, there are some trade-offs. Robots like this may use more materials compared to manual casting, but overall, as we move toward standardization, automation like this is a crucial step forward for MPS technology.
We've also adapted our basic tissue engineering format for our spaceflight experiments. Rather than using the regular commercially available plate system, we've partnered with Bioserve Space Technologies to create a tissue chamber suitable for microgravity. To manufacture tissues for spaceflight, chemical and biomedical engineering master student Satvik Kathredi uses our lab's 3D printer to create a stamp which is used to make a custom mold for the tissues. This approach has a slightly lower success rate than the commercially available platform, but with refined technique, we've been able to achieve a 94% success rate in our previous experiments. Microphysiological systems are a huge advancement from past experiments which send live mice or even rats to space, where factors like stress hormones can interfere with results. Here, we hope to have more human-relevant data and reduce the costs, workload, and ethical concerns associated with animal studies in space. Not to mention that I've heard astronauts are not fans of living with rodents. One major concern with using MPS for spaceflight research, however, is that there is still limited space for samples and a high risk of contamination.
Another MPS model here at Kim Lab is to study the blood-brain barrier, or BBB. This animation shows the BBB protecting the brain, letting nutrients in but keep harmful substance out. PhD student Zhipeng Dong is developing an organ-on-a-chip device to mimic human BBB. These chips are more sophisticated than 2D cell cultures. They have tiny channels for us to culture multiple types of brain cells and flow fluid, interacting with each other like in a real brain. Let's see it in action. We are in a dark room using this fluorescent microscope. Zhipeng is testing the permeability of the BBB chip. We use a special fluorescent dye to show what kind of compounds get through the barrier. This helps us study the drug delivery and brain diseases in a more human-relevant way. During this tour, we have seen how the members of Kim Lab combine engineering and biomedical techniques. From the engineered tissues for skeletal and cardiac muscles, to microgravity chambers for spaceflight, and the organ chip for blood-brain barrier, we're pushing the boundaries of what's possible with microphysiological systems. The core of all this effort is to create more human-relevant models that can replace animal testing. This brings me to my work at the Hopkins Tox Policy team. Our goal is to ensure the best available science is not just developed, but also accepted and used to inform policymaking. Thank you for joining us on this tour, and I'm happy to answer your questions now.
Thank you, Yi-Guang, and also Dr. Harriet. We reserve 30 minutes for a Q&A session with our panelists.
I'll start with some of our submitted questions. I guess just a general question to the panel. What are the main barriers to wider adoption of NAMs in the regulatory context, or like the acceptance of them?
I guess I can start. Money, as I said before, is one of the biggest barriers. We simply don't have enough funding to do the validation that we need to do in order to show that these non-animal methods can provide the same information. Another barrier is that companies tend to sell their products internationally, and we don't always have harmonization between all of the different countries yet. Sometimes, for example, like the example that Brienne presented on EPA, I love that example because I'm so glad you presented it, because it's really another example of EPA being a leader, but they're out in front of other countries and other agencies. And if a company wants to take that chemical to Europe, they would have to do the animal tests currently. So international harmonization is an issue. And the third thing I would say is there are, in the academic and research space, scientists can take on new models and start using them without a lot of fuss, right? They can just use them to answer questions. But we have, for many decades, built up this sort of regulatory policies and procedures that have all kinds of knock-on effects if we change them. Just an example is the labeling system that EPA has for chemicals and whether they cause severe or mild eye irritation, skin irritation, things like that. Now, local governments and state governments and companies have integrated all of that regulatory structure into their purchasing practices and regulations. And so if EPA changes the labeling to be based on new in vitro tests, then there are all these effects down the line and all of these other stakeholders that need to be kind of brought on board to accept those changes. So it tends to be really challenging to change a lot of those practices.
And I think I also just want to echo the money and time that it really takes to validate these models. We have so many that are currently being used in academia and even in pharmaceutical companies, in crop protection product companies that they're using these currently, but they are literally not submitting the data to EPA or FDA because those agencies tend not to trust it because they haven't been validated. So all it's going to do is open more questions rather than provide these agencies with the confidence that their products are safe. So having a framework in place where these agencies show either companies how they can validate their in-house models or show third parties how, like what framework they want them to follow in order to validate these models, I think is really important. It needs to be an agency-driven effort. Right now, it's you know, sort of all over the place, and because the NAMs haven't been validated, we don't actually know how great they are. So I think that answering that question and doing it in a timely manner with a structured guideline is extremely important to having these actually make it into risk assessment.
One more thing I want to say is maybe education and trainings. Many students, as Justin earlier said, he was exposed to animal testings at first he went to college. So it's the same thing now. Many students are starting their research career with animal models, and they're not aware of animal models or aware of alternative to animal testing. So if we have more training sessions, educational opportunities, people are having more confident in this new technologies, there will be a brighter future for these new methods.
If I were to chime in, I would echo all of that. And I mean, I especially echo familiarity. That's such a big thing. When I worked in cancer genomics, even getting like experienced oncologists to incorporate that into their patient care was super hard. Let alone like giving them a completely new platform to base their decision making off of. So familiarity for sure.
Two questions. I hope I can articulate them. So the first is, Christy, you mentioned the Syngenta example. And Brianna, I'm sorry, I forget the name of the example you mentioned, but so those were instances where the companies did approach the agency about the NAM. And I'm assuming it wasn't just out of the kindness of their hearts. And so I'm wondering what it is that's prompting some entities in some instances to do that. Is it just that they're going to be able to save that much money? And then perhaps somewhat related, it seems that the toxics testing issue has pitted the animal protection movement and environmental justice and environmental movement against one another a bit. And there's contentions that we need to do tests because they're more reliable. And I'm just wondering how you think the best way to navigate that is.
So the first question is, with regards to the example that I showed, that going through that process costs Syngenta 3 or 4 times the amount that it would have costed them to just do the animal study. So at first, it's not cost effective. Eventually, when it becomes common practice, it may become cost effective, but a lot of times they're spending a lot on like scientific consultants and to build that case and then go through all of these meetings and presentations and discussions with the agency. I know the scientists from Syngenta who worked on that, and it truly was motivated by animal welfare because they knew that if they gave that chemical to the animals, it essentially dissolves your respiratory tissue. So it would have been incredibly cruel, and they wanted to try to use this alternative approach. I wish we had more of those folks at a lot of different companies. Most companies are not willing to stick their necks out like that and need agencies to, as Brianna was mentioning, give the companies some guidance and certainty that if they use alternative methods, they will be accepted. In terms of the sort of environmental NGOs and sort of defending the need for continuing to do animal tests, I think that that point of view comes from the fact that throughout our history, you can point to a lot of examples of bad behavior by chemical and pesticide companies and by drug companies. And I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I think their view is that no matter what testing system you're using, the companies are going to try to find a way to work it out to their advantage. From what I have seen in all of the data that I have looked at in terms of chemicals tested with non-animal methods, the non-animal methods in general tend to be more sensitive. And so I think as we start getting more experience using them, I'm hoping that that will start to convince those NGOs that we can use them for importance.
Adding on to that, I think there's actually a real opportunity for patient-derived samples to be incorporated into these new approach methodologies so that you do get a more broad look at the genetic diversity within a population, or for populations that may have pre-existing conditions. So you can actually look at the human level variance there that you would not be able to do in an animal model.
I'll ask another one of our submitted questions. This question is, how do the results from NAMs compare to traditional animal testing in terms of accuracy, reproducibility, and relevance to human outcomes? I know you already spoke to this, but maybe we could just emphasize this a little more.
Well, in science, as in law, it depends. The challenge with answering this question is that it is not ethical to expose people to many of these chemicals. So we don't always know what the real human answer is. We can do our best to try to guess based on epidemiology or based on past experiences, or maybe even like clinical or occupational reports. And there's a lot of efforts to try to do things like that in order to validate non-animal approaches. We do have a lot of human data for one particular endpoint, which is skin sensitization. And there was an effort to compare the typical animal test that had been used up until very recently, the local lymph node assay, which is a test in mice, to the new approaches that were being developed. And it found that if you combine 2 or 3 different in vitro cellular models, and you compared the productivity, the accuracy, the reproducibility of the local lymph node assay with the in vitro approach, the in vitro approach outperformed the animal test. That just gives us information about sensitization though. And we often don't know exactly how humans metabolize and when they're exposed to chemicals, where do they go in the body? They turn into other chemicals sometimes. We can model that, but we don't always know that. And we don't know that from animal experiments because animals are really different and they handle chemicals really differently than us. So one way that we could do that is with clinical information from pharmaceuticals. There are challenges to getting that data though, but the EPA is actually working on a paper to show that a battery of in vitro tests that they're using to predict potential toxicity to the entire system, systemic toxicity. It's a huge test requirement. It's really challenging to replace. So they created a battery of potential tests to do this without animals. And they're testing that battery with a number of pharmaceuticals and going to be comparing the two. And that's ongoing activity that hasn't been published yet, but I've heard that it's actually really promising. So that would be helpful.
And so shifting to another endpoint, so drug-induced liver injury is actually the #1 reason why pharmaceuticals are pulled from the market. And I got the opportunity a couple years ago to work on a systematic review where it was a very unique situation. We were looking at anti-diabetic drugs troglodyzone and rosiglitazone that had both been introduced to the market. We have the human epidemiological data because these pharmaceutical companies are required to conduct ongoing monitoring of their drugs. We had the preclinical animal studies, and then we had in vitro tests that were performed, down the line. And what we saw was, so troglodyzone is actually caused a lot of patient deaths and was removed from the market. We did not see that signal in any of the animal studies, which is why it was allowed to progress to clinical trials and onto the market. But when we went and looked back at the comparison of those two pharmaceuticals in the new approach methods, the in vitro methods, we actually did see the signal. So it was a very interesting case where when you do have this data side by side, the animal data, which is currently treated as the gold standard, is not necessarily the gold standard. And using these human cell lines and these new approach methodologies can get us closer to the actual truth and prevent these compounds from reaching the market, because pharmaceutical companies don't want to kill people. They want their drugs to help people and they want to make money off of that. So it is in their best interest to remove potential drug from their pipeline if it's going to be extremely toxic. That's just one instance where the utilization of the in vitro models would have really helped there.
Same thing, same situation also happened with my experiment on cardiac drugs. Some of the drugs are showing toxicity effect in clinical trials, and or even after they are on the market and it's because of bad effect, bad compliance on patient. Some of our cardiac models can capture these risks. We are short on resources, fundings. We need to test more drugs, or even some drugs that are a preclinical that we won't test it in-house in our lab to show if it can really outperform animal models. For now, I think because of the limitation of the human data we got, so sometimes we still need to compare to existing animal data that compared to what we got from our new approach method. I think it's not very efficient way to do that, but that's the reality we have to face.
I have a few prepared questions as well. One question that I have for you, Christy, is have you encountered any misconceptions about the reliability of non-animal testing methods?
Well, my scientist brain interprets the reliability word literally, so I'm going to say no, actually, because for us, reliability means, do you get the same answer every time you do the test? And for a number of different reasons, in vitro methods tend to be more reliable. But I would say there's a lot of, within the general toxicology community overall, I would say in terms of accuracy, there are a lot of concerns and or doubts about whether, even though we're talking about, in most cases, human cells or tissues, that they cannot model the in vivo, the in life organism, because, and it's true, there are interactions among different organs and systems in the body that impact that potential toxicity or the potential effects. But in my view, you can create that complexity with multiple types of methods, whether you combine a lot of different in vitro models or you combine in silico and in vitro models together to give you that whole system view that you're trying to get.
And then a second question that I have for you is, how can we better incentivize industries to adopt NAMs, especially when the regulatory path of these resistance is still animal testing?
Most industry that are trying to put products on the market, their view is time is money. Because especially if you're talking about a pesticide, they want to get it onto the market in time for the growing season so that farmers can use it. And that comes around once a year, right? Or the harvest season or whatever their particular chemical is supposed to do. And so if they try an alternative approach and then it takes longer for EPA to review that than it would have with the traditional data package, then they lose that growing season and then they lose millions of dollars, right? So there's not a lot of motivation for them to try something new. So the best way to incentivize that is for clarity from the agencies to tell companies, yes, we would accept this under these specific scenarios, or even just general messages of support, like we want companies to use alternative methods, and we have an open door policy, things like that would be really, really helpful.
I had a question for you guys, just in general about the space of like the new method testing in your specific like laboratories and programs, and are there other similar type programs, PhD motivated programs throughout the country that are doing similar work, or are you guys kind of niche in that aspect? And then two, kind of on top of that, is it difficult securing funding for these new approaches as opposed to more traditional approaches? I mean, I know funding for like PhD programs and things like that is so competitive right now. And I'm just curious if it's been kind of difficult to break into that in competing with other types of labs and other entities.
I can start on that. So our lab started the Microphysiological Systems World Summit, which is actually a collaboration between NAM developers, academics, and end users globally. And there is a very sizable footprint. I think we get like about 1,000 registrants to that every single year who are coming and showing the advancements in their own models. There is, I think, starting to be more adoption of these models at universities, both domestically and abroad. I think Europe has a bit of a better track record for incentivizing NAM use. So I would imagine that there's, most of the companies that I end up interacting with are actually European companies. And I, think it's that way for a reason. But secondarily about funding. So the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing is in a great position where we actually get private donor funding because there are people who are very interested in the advancement of non-animal methods. So that is, sort of a unique scenario in academia, whereas right now everybody is losing funding, very rapidly, and it's extremely unfortunate. But from a very personal perspective, we're doing okay in that regard.
The lab I was working on, the Kim lab at Hopkins, I think the major funding source is NIH, and there have some current funding going on. But those fundings, from what I know, is a collaboration with other institutes in this field. So the money going to this lab is limited, but still well positioned. And also the PI of the lab, Dr. Kim, he got funding from other sources, like from Korean government for in that regard. So their funding source is being cutting right now, but there is still sourcing in this field, but absolutely we need more funding in this field.
Brian and I work in the same lab, so I'm going to defer to her answer.
I can also mention in terms of contract research organizations, we are a little unique in that we are all in vitro. Most contract research organizations do a lot of animal testing, but we are training more and more of our competitors to bring on in vitro methods, which is a good thing. So we find every year that goes by that some of the traditional, very animal heavy CROs are starting now to be known for using in vitro methods as well. So they see where things are going, certainly. I wanted to mention also in terms of the previous panel brought this up, which is in terms of NIH funding overall, a very, very small percentage of it goes to what you would consider alternative methods or in vitro or computational approaches. And, I think that has to change. One of the reasons is because most of the current researchers sit on what they're called study sections, which decide how the grants are handed out and which grants are handed out and how much money they get. So it's kind of animal research is begetting more animal research. And so I think that needs to change and be more diverse in order to get more funding for animal methods.
There has been just a slight mention of silicon-based research. I would assume the next 5 years is going to have such an explosion of capacity in artificial intelligence that it ought to be a tool that's very important to you all, but you really haven't mentioned it very much.
That's because I'm a biologist.
I think we should defer to Jason on this one.
Oh gosh, where do I begin? The applicability of artificial intelligence. So I thought long and hard about how do I incorporate that into my presentation, because in our lab I'm kind of known as the AI guy, and I'm not I'm not super on board with its immediate impact, but long term I think it's going to do amazing things. So one thing that AI isn't necessarily great at is getting at the molecular mechanism of toxicity or disease. It's great at predicting things. Do you have disease? Do you not have disease? However, I think a lot more data science work where we're, looking at, I don't know, not necessarily predicting things, but just saying, okay, this is upregulated. Why is it upregulated? What's the context? What's the causality? Flushing out the mechanism before we build a model to say, disease, no disease, if that makes any sense. And I can further elaborate on anything I just said.
I can also mention a couple of applications in toxicology. There is actually there's something called a nanostring algorithm that has been used in an OECD test guideline. So it uses a combination of a dendritic cell, an immune cell, and then it takes genetic readings of how the cell responds to a chemical exposure, and then uses that algorithm to assess whether all of those genetic changes mean that the chemical is a skin sensitizer or not a skin sensitizer. So that was really, really fun to try to get that particular application through the OECD test guideline process, because they are used to seeing all of the data, and this is a proprietary algorithm. So we had to create this sort of new scenario within the OECD where we could let some people see the algorithm, but keep it private, and then they, let the test guideline go through. But I will say nobody actually looked at the algorithm. They just wanted to know it was there, and they could have looked at it if they tried. So that's, biologists and in silico modelers don't always work together very well, but we are seeing a lot more of that. And I think it's really, really important to foster those types of collaborations, because in fact, there is a lot of power in computer, in algorithms, not really what you think of when you think of AI, like generative AI or anything like that, but in helping do tasks that take people a long time to do, like look at a huge set of research papers. We have a research topic that you find 20,000 papers. Can we use those models to help pull out the important pieces of information that then we can use to analyze that data, for example?
Thank you. I believe we have time for one or two more questions. Anybody would like to ask any other questions?
I'll ask one if other people don't have it, but I don't want to dominate.
I'm curious, Christy, you mentioned the organ, the lung, I think. And I'm curious to hear more about that. Like if you're an organ donor, then like, is there a way to make sure that you can contribute in that way, or is that automatically come along with being an organ donor? How does that work?
Contest. So if you say that you're an organ donor, you sign up.
Yeah.
Then when you pass away, typically what happens is donation gets priority. So any organ that is in really good condition is going to go to a donation scheme. But anything that isn't or isn't needed for donation could be given to scientists. Sometimes you can be more directed, like there are certain, especially around like medical centers and university towns, there will be ongoing research studies where if you're getting a surgical procedure, then you can donate that leftover tissue to science or to testing.
I just wanted to, ask the panel about studying things in environments where we can't normally study things. So the lab tour ended with talking about sending these microphysiological systems, these organic chips, into space. And just maybe get your reflections on the value of new approach methodologies for those sorts of environments.
Maybe eventually, before human actually get to Mars, we can send a human chip to Mars to see how that turns out. And also, I know there's some research of radiation that they can expose the chips to a radiation chamber and to find out what kind of bad things will happen on the human tissue. We can definitely not send any person into that environment. So I think in that regard, that's also a value of the new method. And animals will be ethical too.
And I also think just generally in toxicity testing right now, we are sort of in a guinea pig scenario where a lot of these chemicals are released without being tested. And the first time that we really see an indication of damage is when something happens at the population level. And then people see that and then, subsequently devote resources to studying it. So in a world where NAMs are, more accessible, cheaper, and perhaps even required as a part of like chemical or like pesticide registration or chemical pre-manufacturer notices, we might be able to get that information ahead of time.
So I didn't talk very much about the environment, but of course we care about whether chemicals and pesticides affect all the animals in the environment too, right? From fish to other aquatic systems to birds, mammals. And right now, what we essentially do is companies are required to test chemicals on 1 or 2 fish species and in a few different bird species for a couple of different tests. And you can imagine that does not necessarily give us information on all of the diversity of the animal kingdom that we have in our world, right? So I think that NAMs could be extremely useful for the environment because we could use, let's say, a set of in vitro methods that represent a bunch of different fish species or a bunch of different bird species. And because they are cheaper and faster and miniaturized, that gives us a lot more information about what might be going on and whether different species are more sensitive than the species that are represented in that kind of toxicity testing package.
Tying it back to publicly available data and your point about the environment, there are lots of genomes now available for a lot of different organisms. And if we have evidence that, a certain chemical might influence a certain pathway, we can take a look at the genomes of these organisms, see if they have some of the relevant biology and make some assessments that way as well.
All right, well, that concludes our second panel. Thank you for our amazing speakers. It's very exciting and informative conversation. I'll let Drew take it from here.
Thank you all very much for coming to the Animal and Natural Resource Law Reviews Volume 21 Symposium. It's been a privilege to share this space with so many thoughtful scholars, scientists, and advocates, and students committed to exploring alternatives to animals in testing and research. On behalf of the Animal and Natural Resource Law Review, I want to extend our sincere gratitude to each of our speakers for sharing your expertise and perspective throughout the day. Your contributions brought depth to our conversation and helped illuminate the legal, scientific, and policy challenges involved in transitioning toward more ethical and innovative research methods. We're also incredibly grateful to our partners at Johns Hopkins University Toxicology Policy Program for their collaboration and leadership in this field. Thank you as well to Professor David Faber, whose continued support of our journal makes events like this possible, and to Dean Sanambrosio for taking his time to join us today. To everyone who joined us today, whether it was in person or virtually, thank you for engaging in these important conversations. We hope that you left feeling inspired and better informed about the many ways legal and scientific communities can work together to promote responsible innovation. We look forward to sharing Volume 21 of the Animal and Natural Resource Law Review with you soon, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you again, and safe travels home.